It all started with the letter. Well, technically, it started with me moving into the cheapest apartment I could find. But the letter is where things got weird. The apartment was in one of those old brick buildings that look charming in the daylight, but turn creepy as hell once the sun goes down. It had creaky wooden floors, radiators that hissed like angry cats, and a landlord named Frank who looked like he might have been alive when the building was first constructed. The rent was suspiciously low, but I figured it was because the neighborhood wasn't exactly up and coming. The only thing coming here was probably the occasional police siren. I'd been in the apartment for about 3 days when I found the letter. It was tucked under the bed in the bedroom, folded neatly, with my name written on it in shaky, spidery handwriting. Now, this was odd for a couple of reasons. First, I hadn't given anyone my new address. Second, who the hell hides letters under beds? My first thought was that it was some weird prank from the last tenant, but my curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded it. "Dear new tenant," it began, which already felt ominous. "Welcome to apartment 3B. If you want to live here in peace, there are rules you must follow. Please read carefully and do not ignore them." There was a list, neatly numbered. 1. Do not use the radiator in the bedroom after 10 p.m. It attracts attention. 2. If you hear footsteps above you, ignore them. The 4th floor has been empty since 1997. 3. Do not look out the kitchen window after midnight. No matter what you hear, keep the curtains closed. 4. If the lights flicker 3 times in the hallway, stay inside your apartment until they stop. 5. Do not open the door for anyone after 2 a.m., no matter what they say. I read the list twice, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But no one did. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional groan of the pipes. My first instinct was to crumple the letter and toss it, but something about it made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that the rules weren't just a prank. They felt deliberate. By the end of the week, I'd mostly forgotten about the letter. Nothing weird had happened, and I figured maybe the last tenant was just a creative type with too much time on their hands. Then the radiator thing happened. It was a cold night, and I'd turned on the radiator in the bedroom without thinking. I was scrolling on my phone in bed when I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It started soft, almost like raindrops, but quickly grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the walls. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then the tapping stopped, and a voice whispered, clear as day, "I see you." I leapt out of bed like it was on fire, fumbling to turn off the radiator. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I stood there in the dark for what felt like hours, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I crawled onto the couch in the living room and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The next day, I reread the letter. The rules didn't seem funny anymore. The footsteps started a week later. I was watching TV when I heard them. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone walking with boots. They came from the ceiling, directly above me. I remembered rule number 2 and froze, my eyes glued to the screen. The 4th floor has been empty since 1997. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something. Anything to keep my imagination from spiraling. The steps continued for about 5 minutes before stopping. I didn't sleep that night. Things escalated from there. The kitchen window became a problem around midnight on a windy Thursday. I was pouring a glass of water when I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass. My stomach sank as I glanced at the clock. 12:03 a.m. Rule number 3. No matter what you hear, keep the curtains closed. The tapping grew louder, more urgent. I set the glass down, my hands shaking. Then a voice, low and sing-song, came from the other side of the window. "Let me in. It's so cold out here." My throat closed. I backed away from the window, staring at the curtain, willing myself not to look. The voice came again, softer this time. "Please, I just want to come inside." I spent the rest of the night huddled in the bathroom with all the lights on, gripping a frying pan like it was Excalibur. By now, I was half convinced I was losing my mind. I tried talking to Frank about it, asked if the place had some kind of history or if anyone else had complained about strange noises. He gave me a long, hard look and said, "You should have read the lease more carefully. Clause 17. Then he walked away, whistling like I hadn't just asked him about ghost voices. I dug out my lease as soon as I got home. Sure enough, there it was in tiny print. Tenant acknowledges responsibility for adherence to house-specific guidelines. Guidelines. Right. The final straw came on a Friday night. I woke up at 2:14 a.m. to a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Rule number 5. Do not open the door for anyone after 2 a.m., no matter what they say. "Hey," a voice called. It was a woman's voice, light and friendly. "I think I left my wallet here earlier. Could you let me in real quick?" I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body screaming. "Wrong apartment," I called back, my voice shaking. "Are you sure?" the voice replied, a little closer this time. "I'm positive it's this one." The doorknob jiggled. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Eventually, the voice stopped and the knocking faded away. But when I checked the peephole the next morning, there were no footprints in the fresh snow outside the door. I moved out the next day. Didn't even bother getting my security deposit back. If Frank wants to keep his cursed apartment, he can have it. So, what about you? Ever had a place that made you question reality? Because I can't be the only one who's lived in a house with rules like that, right? The first time I met Ellie, she was robbing me. Okay, technically, she was returning what she'd stolen, but at that moment, all I could think was, who breaks into someone's car just to leave something behind? It was late, sometime around midnight, and I'd parked my beat-up Corolla in the sketchiest corner of the grocery store parking lot because, obviously, I make great life choices. I had just gotten off a late shift and was juggling bags of snacks and cheap wine, dreaming of collapsing into bed, when I saw her. She was crouched by the driver's side door, fiddling with something in her hands. "Hey!" I shouted, dropping my bags. She jumped about 3 feet in the air and whipped around to face me, holding a book? Not my phone, not my stereo, not even the ancient pack of gum I'd left in the cup holder. A book. "This is yours, right?" she asked, like she wasn't actively crouched by my car like a raccoon caught in the headlights. She held it out to me, a little dog-eared copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that I'd loaned to a friend months ago and completely forgotten about. Yeah?" I said, too confused to even be angry. "Where did you get that?" She shrugged. "Your friend left it at the coffee shop where I work." I recognized the name in the cover. "Marcus, right? He said it was yours. So here." She shoved the book into my hands, wiped her palms on her jeans, and started walking away like nothing had happened. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, staring after her, before I finally yelled, "Wait, why didn't you just give it to him?" She turned around, walking backward now. He never came back. Didn't want it to go to waste. Then she grinned, this big, ridiculous grin, and disappeared into the night. The whole thing was so surreal. I wasn't even sure it had actually happened until I saw the book sitting on my passenger seat the next morning. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not because I was interested or anything. More like trying to solve a weird riddle. Who goes to that much trouble to return a book to someone they don't even know? And why was she so casual about breaking into my car to do it? But life moved on, and I didn't see her again. Not until the great laundry crisis of 2 months later. I was at the laundromat, fighting with a machine that had decided to eat my quarters and refuse me the right to clean socks, when I heard someone say, "You again?" I turned, and there she was, leaning against a washing machine, looking every bit as chaotic as I remembered. She was wearing mismatched socks, her hair tied up with what looked suspiciously like a shoelace, and she had that same ridiculous grin on her face. "You're the book thief," I said before I could stop myself. She gasped in mock horror. "Excuse you. I'm the book returner." Big difference. We ended up talking while our clothes tumbled around in the machines, and by talking, I mean she talked and I mostly stared at her in disbelief. Her name was Ellie, and she had the kind of energy that felt like standing too close to an electrical storm. She told me about how she lived in 6 different cities in the past 3 years, how she made most of her money doing odd jobs, and how she once spent an entire summer hitchhiking with a ukulele and a backpack full of novelty socks. She was a lot. Too much, really. The kind of person who burns bright, but probably leaves you in ashes if you stand too close for too long. But when my dryer decided to give up halfway through the cycle and leave all my clothes soggy, Ellie pulled out a hairdryer from her bag. Why did she even have a hairdryer? Plugged it in, and started helping me dry each piece by hand. She acted like it was the most normal thing in the world. Like we were old friends instead of two strangers who'd met under incredibly weird circumstances. After that, Ellie started showing up everywhere. Not on purpose, at least, I don't think so. But I'd run into her at the coffee shop, at the farmer's market, even at this hole-in-the-wall bookstore I liked to visit when I needed a quiet place to think. Every time, she'd barrel into my life like a whirlwind, dragging me into some new adventure. One time, she convinced me to crash a yoga class at the park because they were giving out free smoothies. Another time, we spent hours wandering around an antique store, making up backstories for all the old furniture. She had this way of making every moment feel like it mattered, even the small ones. Especially the small ones. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday, the kind of day where you just want to stay in bed and pretend the world doesn't exist. I was curled up on my couch, half asleep, when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Ellie standing there, soaked to the bone but grinning like a lunatic. "Come on," she said, holding out her hand. "What?" I asked, still groggy. "Where?" "You'll see." Against my better judgment, I grabbed a jacket and followed her. She led me to an abandoned lot on the edge of town, where a carnival had been set up but was closed for the rain. The rides were all shut down, the booths empty, but Ellie didn't seem to care. She dragged me under the striped awning of a popcorn stand and pulled out 2 sparklers from her bag, because of course she had sparklers. "Why are we here?" I asked, laughing despite myself. "Because rainy days are the best days for carnivals," she said, lighting the sparklers and handing one to me. "You don't have to wait in line, and the lights look prettier in the rain." We spent the next hour wandering through the empty carnival, sparklers in hand, pretending we were the last people on Earth. And in that moment, with the rain falling and Ellie spinning in circles under the string lights, I realized I didn't just like her chaos, I needed it. She made life feel big, like anything was possible, even if it was just for a little while. Ellie still shows up unannounced, still drags me into her wild schemes, still makes me question every practical decision I've ever made. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. Have you ever met someone who completely upended your life in the best possible way? The sound hit me first. A faint, tinny jingle, the kind you'd almost mistake for wind chimes if it didn't feel so deliberate. I was in the basement, knee-deep in the chaos of cleaning out boxes that hadn't been opened since I moved in years ago. The jingle came again, sharper this time, cutting through the silence like a question you couldn't ignore. I froze, my hands still gripping a stack of yellowed magazines. It wasn't the kind of sound you expected to hear in a basement. Too light, too alive. Slowly, I set the magazines down and followed the noise, weaving through the maze of half-unpacked boxes until I found the source. It was coming from an old metal lunchbox. I hadn't seen that lunchbox in decades, but I recognized it instantly. Bright red, with a faded image of a rocket ship blasting off into space. Its paint chipped and its corners dented from years of rough handling. My name was still scrawled on the bottom in shaky black marker. Evan W. My breath caught in my chest. The lunchbox had been a constant companion when I was a kid, more treasure chest than meal container. I could still picture it swinging from my hand as I tore across the playground, stuffed with trading cards, crumpled drawings, and little odds and ends I deemed too valuable to leave at home. I thought it was gone. Carefully, I picked it up, the faded metal cool under my fingertips. I tilted it, and the jingle sounded again. Something inside was shifting. I clicked the latch and slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a mess of tangled string, old buttons, a rusty key, a handful of plastic army men, and, at the very bottom, a small silver bell. I stared at the bell for a long time. It wasn't fancy, just a simple thing about the size of a walnut, with a few scratches on its surface. But seeing it was like watching a door creak open in my mind. I remembered it now. The bell had been part of a game. Not just any game, but the game. The bell belonged to the Finders Keepers kit, a collection of random objects we'd cobbled together when we were kids. It was me, Sarah, and Benny, the 3 of us inseparable during those endless summer afternoons when time felt like it stretched forever. We'd created an elaborate game where one person, the keeper, would hide the bell, and the others, the seekers, had to find it using a series of riddles, clues, and challenges. The rules were simple. If you found the bell, you got to be the keeper. And if you were the keeper, you ruled the world. I smiled to myself, running my thumb over the cool metal of the bell. I could almost hear Benny's voice, always full of excitement, explaining some overly complex new rule he dreamed up. I could see Sarah rolling her eyes but grinning anyway, her hair a tangle of sunlight as we sprinted through the woods behind her house, searching for the next clue. But then the smile faltered. There was one day I'd never quite been able to forget. The last day we played the game. It had been Sarah's turn to hide the bell, and she'd promised the best hiding spot yet. She made us swear not to follow her, then vanished into the woods with her hands cupped around the bell like it was a secret too precious for anyone else to see. Benny and I waited, counting down the minutes until it was time to search. But when we finally tore into the woods, she was gone. At first, we thought she was just hiding, part of the game. We called her name, laughing and pretending to act like detectives. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the laughter faded. The woods started to feel darker, the air heavier. By the time her parents showed up with flashlights and panicked expressions, the game didn't feel like a game anymore. We found her eventually. She was sitting by the creek, knees pulled up to her chest, the bell clutched tightly in her hand. She wouldn't tell us what happened, wouldn't say a word, not even to Benny, who was always the one to coax her out of her shell. Her mom had to carry her home. That was the last time we played Finders Keepers. By the end of the summer, Benny's family moved away, and Sarah and I drifted into different circles at school. The bell and the game were forgotten, or so I thought. Back in the basement, I couldn't take my eyes off the bell. I picked it up, and a faint shiver ran through me, like static electricity. "Come and find me," a voice whispered, soft and distant. I froze. It wasn't real, couldn't be. Just my mind playing tricks, stirred up by the rush of old memories. But then it came again, a little clearer this time. "Come and find me." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something about the bell felt alive. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that it was just a bell, just a stupid piece of metal from a game we used to play. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the air in the basement had shifted, like the walls had leaned in just a little closer. "Come and find me." The voice was louder now, insistent. I dropped the bell back into the lunchbox and snapped the lid shut. The jingle of its fall echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A sound from the woods behind the house. The faint, unmistakable jingle of a bell. The envelope arrived with no return address, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was in my own hand, looping and sharp, the way I used to write before switching to block letters to mask my atrocious penmanship. It was sitting on my kitchen counter when I came home, pristine and out of place among the mess of unopened bills and empty coffee mugs. I stood there for a long time, staring at it like it might spring open and bite me. Eventually, curiosity won over caution. I slid my finger under the seal, careful not to rip the paper, and pulled out a single sheet. The note was short, written in the same familiar scrawl. "Meet me where it began. Midnight. Don't be late." No signature. No explanation. Just those cryptic words. Where it began. I turned the note over, half expecting more, but the page was blank. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of prank. But then, my chest tightened with a sensation I couldn't name. A memory, maybe, or the ghost of one. I didn't know where it began, but a part of me felt like I should. That night, I couldn't sleep. The note sat on my bedside table, taunting me, until finally, at 11:45, I grabbed my jacket and my keys and drove without thinking. My hands moved on autopilot, guiding me through back roads and over a bridge that creaked under the weight of my car. I ended up at the old quarry, a place I hadn't been to in over a decade. It wasn't a happy place. The quarry had been our hideout back in high school, a spot just far enough from civilization to feel rebellious, but close enough to retreat if things went south. It was where we drank cheap beer, told half-truths about our futures, and tried to convince ourselves we weren't scared of the dark. It was also where we lost Caleb. Caleb had been the glue of our little group, the The one who could make you laugh even when the world was crumbling. He was the daredevil, the one who'd leap before looking and somehow always land on his feet, until the night he didn't. We'd been goofing around near the edge of the cliff, a little too drunk, a little too reckless. Caleb decided to show off, balancing on the narrowest part of the ledge. We'd all laughed, cheered him on. Then there was the sickening sound of rock crumbling underfoot, and Caleb was gone. We'd searched for hours, calling his name until our voices gave out, but we never found him. The cops said he probably hit the water and got swept downstream. A freak accident. That's what they called it. But none of us ever went back to the quarry. Not until now. The clock on my dashboard blinked 11:59 as I pulled into the gravel lot. The air was cold, and the wind carried the faint smell of damp earth and pine. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out, my breath forming pale clouds in the darkness. The quarry looked smaller than I remembered, its jagged cliffs less imposing. But the unease was still there, that gnawing feeling that the place wasn't quite right. I scanned the area, half expecting to find someone waiting for me, but there was nothing. Okay, I muttered to myself, my voice too loud in the stillness. I'm here. Now what? The flashlight beam cut through the shadows, bouncing off rocks and broken beer bottles. I walked toward the edge of the cliff, my heart pounding harder with each step. That's when I saw him. Caleb. He was sitting on the edge, legs dangling over the drop, just like he used to. His back was to me, but I'd recognize that mop of unruly curls anywhere. Caleb? My voice cracked on the name. He didn't turn around, didn't move. You're dead, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. You can't be here. He stood then, slowly, and turned to face me. His face was pale, his features sharper than I remembered. But it was Caleb, the same lopsided grin, the same glint in his eyes that made you feel like he was always one step ahead of you. Hey, buddy, he said, his voice as casual as if we'd seen each other yesterday. No, I said, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. It's real, Caleb replied, stepping closer. His smile faded, replaced by something heavier, something almost sad. I've been waiting for you. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. This isn't possible. You died. I didn't die, he said, his voice soft. Not really. I fell through. Fell through? I repeated, the words foreign and meaningless. Caleb nodded, gesturing toward the cliff. There's something here. Something under the quarry. It doesn't just take you. It keeps you. Pulls you into another place. What place? I asked, my throat dry. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. It's hard to explain. It's like being caught between pages of a book, stuck in the margins. Time doesn't work there. Nothing does. Not the way you think it should. Why are you here now? I demanded. Because it's opening again, Caleb said, his voice urgent. The quarry, it's waking up. It's hungry. A low rumble shook the ground beneath us, and I stumbled, nearly dropping the flashlight. The air grew heavier, thicker, like we were standing in the eye of a storm. You have to leave, Caleb said, grabbing my arm. His touch was ice cold. You shouldn't have come back. But you're here, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. I can't just leave you here. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've been here for years. You can't save me, but you can save yourself. The rumble grew louder, and the ground split near the edge of the cliff. A deep, inky void yawned open, swallowing the moonlight. Caleb stepped back toward it, his form flickering like a dying bulb. Caleb, I shouted, reaching for him. Go, he yelled, his voice rising above the chaos. Don't look back. I ran. I didn't think, didn't question, just ran. The last thing I heard before I reached my car was his voice, faint but clear. Don't let it take you too. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose, the note still clenched in my hand. But when I looked at it again, the words had changed. Don't forget me. It all started with a broom and an apple. Or rather, the lack of a broom and the existence of an apple one didn't realize had rolled under my couch, until it didn't smell like an apple anymore. I'll set the scene. It was Saturday afternoon, the prime time for avoiding everything productive. I was lounging on my couch, flipping through streaming options with the enthusiasm of someone who's already seen everything twice, when I caught this faint, sour whiff of something off. I sniffed the air, did a quick scan to make sure my cat hadn't done something dramatic, and then immediately regretted my next deep inhale. It was worse. Like fermented regret mixed with bad decisions. At first, I tried to ignore it. Opened a window, lit a candle, but the smell persisted, growing stronger by the minute, like it was daring me to do something about it. Fine. Challenge accepted. I got up and began the search. You know, the one where you start innocently poking around for the source of the smell, and then 2 minutes later, you're basically conducting a crime scene investigation in your own home. Finally, I found it. Tucked way under the couch, behind a small graveyard of dust bunnies and lost pin caps, was an apple. Or rather, what used to be an apple. Now, it looked like it had been cursed by a witch in a particularly bad mood. Half shriveled, half mush, and entirely repulsive. I'd love to say I heroically grabbed it with my bare hands and tossed it away immediately, but the truth is I froze. Like, completely froze. All I could do was stare at it in disgust and horror, as if the apple was going to sprout legs and start explaining itself. But here's where it gets weird. While I was frozen there, staring at this sad, rotten fruit, I started having thoughts. Like, deep, spiraling, probably should see a therapist kind of thoughts. Because the thing is, this apple hadn't just appeared under my couch. I must have put it there, or dropped it, or maybe kicked it under the couch during some chaotic snack session. Either way, it was my mess, and I hadn't even noticed it happening. And suddenly, this apple became a metaphor for everything in my life I avoid dealing with. You know what I mean. That email you keep meaning to send. That drawer full of mystery wires you swear you'll organize one day. That text you've been dodging because it feels too hard to answer. All the little, nagging things you ignore until they rot in the back of your mind and start to stink up the place. I was hit with a wave of guilt so strong it almost knocked me over. And not just about the apple, but about all the times I've let things pile up. Tiny tasks, small problems, manageable anxieties, until they've grown into something overwhelming. I thought about the laundry I hadn't folded, the book I'd been meaning to finish for months, the way I've been telling myself for years that I'm going to start running next week. All of it, just piling up, metaphorical apples rolling under my couch until I couldn't ignore them anymore. The apple didn't say any of this, obviously. It just sat there, being gross. But I swear it was looking at me like, yeah, this is your life now. And I hated it. So, I snapped into action. I grabbed a broom, scooped the apple out from under the couch, and threw it straight into the trash. But I didn't stop there. I vacuumed. I dusted. I cleared out that drawer of mystery wires. I replied to 3 emails I'd been dodging for weeks and even signed up for a 5K because why not go all in? I was a human hurricane of productivity, fueled by a deep desire to never let another apple get the better of me. By the end of the day, I felt incredible, like I'd finally taken back control of my life. One weird, smelly fruit metaphor at a time. Sure, my cat watched the whole thing with her usual judgmental stare, but even she seemed vaguely impressed when the apartment was sparkling and the pile of laundry was gone. Here's the kicker, though. The next morning, I woke up, feeling all smug and accomplished, only to realize the smell was still there. After a second, more thorough investigation, I found the real culprit. A forgotten bag of potatoes in the pantry. The apple hadn't been the problem after all. It was just the first thing I noticed. And you know what? I didn't even mind. Because sometimes, fixing the wrong problem still helps you fix the right one. And sometimes, you've got to clean up the mess you can see before you find the one you didn't even know was there. Anyway, that's how a rotten apple saved my weekend and probably my sanity. What's the weirdest little thing that ever made you completely reevaluate your life? Or at least clean your apartment? Sunday nights were for time travel. It wasn't a formal plan, not at first. It started with a shoebox. I found it buried in the back of my closet one afternoon, crammed full of old postcards, movie ticket stubs, Polaroids with washed-out colors, and letters written in handwriting that didn't look like mine anymore. I was about to shove it back where it came from when she walked in, holding 2 mugs of tea. "What's that?" she asked, peeking over my shoulder. I shrugged. "Just stuff. From a million years ago." Her eyes lit up, the way they always did when she smelled a story. "Oh, no, no, no," she said, plopping down on the floor beside me. "You don't just say stuff and expect me to move on. We're going through this. Right now." That first night, we sifted through the shoebox until the tea turned cold and the clock crept past midnight. Each piece of stuff became a portal. A faded ticket stub from a roller coaster ride led to a story about me throwing up in a trash can immediately after. A crumpled postcard from Paris sparked a tale about my failed attempt to order croissants in French and accidentally asking for angry bread. Every photo was a breadcrumb leading back to a version of me I'd almost forgotten existed. She laughed at the ridiculous stories, gasped at the surprising ones, and teased me mercilessly when I showed her a picture of my regrettable high school haircut. "This," she declared, holding up a Polaroid of me in a hideous sweater, "is gold. I'm framing this." Somewhere along the way, it became a tradition. Every Sunday night, we'd find something, an old journal, a scrapbook, a box of souvenirs, and dive headfirst into the past. It wasn't always my past either. She had her own stash of treasures, a shoebox full of dried flowers, concert wristbands, and a diary so full of doodles that it was barely legible. One Sunday, she pulled out a cassette tape labeled Summer Mix '03. We didn't even own a cassette player, so we spent the entire evening hunting through thrift stores until we found one that worked. When we finally played it, the tape warbled and skipped, but the sound of teenage angst blasted through the speakers. She sang every word to every song, using a wooden spoon as a microphone, while I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the couch. The best Sundays, though, were the ones where we didn't find anything at all. Those nights, we'd invent stories instead. One time, we pretended to be future archaeologists trying to piece together each other's lives from random junk lying around the apartment. "Ah, yes," she said, holding up my old gym shoes with exaggerated reverence. This specimen clearly belonged to a legendary athlete. I countered by examining her chipped coffee mug and declaring it an artifact of a caffeine-worshipping cult. Another night, we spent hours writing fake letters to each other from alternate timelines. A version of her who was a pirate queen. A version of me who was stranded on Mars. But it wasn't always laughs and silliness. Some Sundays, the past had teeth. There was the night she found an old love letter in my shoebox, written by someone who wasn't her. I'd forgotten it was even there, but as soon as she unfolded it, the air in the room shifted. She didn't say anything at first, just read it quietly, her face unreadable. When she finally looked up, her eyes were soft, but her voice was edged with curiosity. What happened with her? I hesitated, feeling like I was holding a live wire. "She wasn't you," I said finally, and her smile, though small, was real. We talked for hours that night, about the people we used to be, the mistakes we'd made, the lessons we learned along the way. By the time we crawled into bed, the tension had dissolved, replaced by a quiet understanding that felt stronger than any declaration of love. Another Sunday, I found an old postcard she'd written to her best friend but never sent. It was from the summer before we met, and it was filled with everything she wanted for her life. Dreams of traveling the world, opening a bookshop, falling in love with someone who made her feel seen. She tried to snatch it out of my hands, embarrassed, but I held it out of reach and read it aloud in my most dramatic voice. "Well," I said when I finished, "I can't promise the bookshop or the world travel, but I'm working on that last part." She blushed and threw a pillow at me, but the way she kissed me afterward told me I was doing okay. Over time, the tradition evolved. We started keeping a journal of our Sunday nights, not just the stories we uncovered, but the ones we created. We wrote about the time we built a fort out of blankets and pretended it was a time machine. We sketched maps of alternate realities where we were pirates or astronauts, or the last 2 people on Earth. Some nights, we wrote letters to our future selves, sealing them in envelopes with strict instructions not to open them until some arbitrary date years from now. The thing about time travel, though, is that you can't stop it. No matter how hard you try to hold on to a moment, it keeps moving forward, slipping through your fingers like sand. One Sunday, the journal sat unopened on the coffee table while we argued over something stupid, whose turn it was to do the laundry, or whether it was too late to order pizza. I don't even remember the fight now, but I remember the silence that followed. It stretched through that night and the next, until one Sunday, she wasn't there at all. For weeks, the shoebox sat untouched in the corner of the room, gathering dust. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I told myself the past was better left where it was, that time travel was a luxury for people who weren't busy trying to figure out how to live in the present. But one rainy Sunday night, I gave in. I opened the box, pulled out the journal, and started flipping through the pages. Each entry was like a breadcrumb trail, leading me back to a version of us I wasn't sure I could face. But as I read, something strange happened. The memories didn't hurt the way I thought they would. Instead, they felt warm, like sitting by a fire on a cold night. I don't know if I'll ever time travel with someone like that again. Maybe it was a one-time magic, something that only worked because it was her. But I do know this. Every Sunday night, I still light a candle, pour myself a cup of tea, and open the journal. I don't add to it, not yet, but I read the stories, the real ones, the made-up ones, all of it, and remember what it felt like to share a life with someone who made even the past feel alive. What about you? Do you have any traditions that let you travel through time with someone you love? It happened last Thursday at exactly 3:13 p.m., which is oddly specific for something as mundane as the realization that I was talking to my microwave. Not yelling or cursing, mind you. This wasn't one of those angry appliance moments where the door jams or the buttons stick. No, I was gently encouraging it. "Come on, buddy," I said, staring at the countdown as it ticked down from 30 seconds. "You've got this." And then it hit me. I was cheering on a box that heats food using radiation. To be fair, this wasn't entirely unprovoked. The day before, my microwave had started making a noise that could only be described as a metallic groan, a sound that whispered, "I'm tired, Karen, and you keep reheating soup at weird hours." I'd promised myself I'd Google microwave groaning noise later, but for now, I was just willing it to make it through one more bowl of lentil soup without exploding. That's what we do now, isn't it? We form weirdly human relationships with things that should, by all logic, just be objects. The microwave beeped, thankfully without incident, and as I carried my soup to the table, I thought about how ridiculous life has become. At least once a week, my robot vacuum gets stuck under the couch and sends me an alert that reads, "I'm trapped. Please help." It's the most pitiful cry for assistance I've ever seen, and every time, I find myself crouching on the floor, muttering, "You're okay, little buddy. I've got you." I always imagine it breathing a tiny sigh of relief as I set it free, even though I know full well it doesn't have lungs or feelings. Or at least I hope it doesn't. But the thing that truly drove home how much our lives have changed came later that same afternoon. I was scrolling through an online store, the kind where you go in for one thing and emerge with 7 items you never knew existed, and I stumbled upon a product so absurd I thought it had to be a joke. An electric salt shaker. It was sleek, minimalist, and advertised as the future of seasoning. I stared at the screen, imagining a dystopian future where even sprinkling salt by hand was deemed too taxing. Who needs this? I whispered to myself, and then, of course, I added it to my cart. Because that's the thing. These little modern conveniences aren't just practical. They're tempting in a way that feels almost conspiratorial, like the apps that reward you for the most basic human functions. I've been congratulated for everything from drinking water to standing up for a minute, things I didn't even know I needed validation for. My smartwatch, in particular, has turned into a cross between a cheerleader and a helicopter parent. It buzzes constantly, "Time to move. You're crushing it. Don't forget to breathe." Breathe. As if I'd forget. But sometimes, these little absurdities are endearing. Like the other night, when I ordered pizza and the delivery tracker told me my driver's name was Fabio. As the little cartoon car inched closer to my apartment, I imagined Fabio heroically braving the city streets, cradling my pepperoni pizza like a newborn child. When he finally arrived, I couldn't resist opening the door with a dramatic, "Fabio, My hero. He blinked at me like I was insane, handed me the box, and walked away without a word. Still, the interaction made my entire evening. Even the way we talk to each other has become its own kind of performance. My group chat, for instance, is now 70% memes, 20% GIFs, and maybe 10% actual communication. Yesterday, someone shared a distorted picture of a goose with the caption, "Me at 2 a.m., contemplating the nature of existence." It was followed by a string of crying laughing emojis and a single mood. That was it. No explanation, no context. And yet, somehow, I knew exactly what they meant. Sometimes, I wonder what people from 100 years ago would think if they could see us now. Imagine trying to explain that instead of writing heartfelt letters, we express affection by sending each other TikToks of raccoons stealing snacks. Or that instead of reading books by candlelight, we binge-watch entire seasons of shows about baking disasters while doom-scrolling through Twitter. It's absurd. It's wonderful. It's a little bit tragic. The wildest part, though, is how seamlessly all of this blends into daily life. Like how I've stopped questioning why my fridge sends me weather updates, or how I trust my phone's autocomplete more than my own spelling instincts, or the fact that I can order a single avocado online and have it delivered within the hour, wrapped in more packaging than it's worth, as if it's a rare artifact instead of a piece of fruit. And don't get me started on notifications. The other day, my meditation app sent me a message that read, "You haven't checked in for a while. Everything okay?" It was so eerily personal that I almost replied, "Yeah, just busy, thanks." Then there's my streaming service, which insists on asking, "Are you still watching?" Yes, Netflix, I am still watching, and I resent your judgmental tone. But as ridiculous as all of this is, I can't deny how much joy it brings me. There's something oddly magical about living in a world where even the most mundane things feel a little theatrical. Whether it's my toaster announcing it's done with a triumphant ding, or my smart speaker playing the perfect song at the perfect time. These tiny moments remind me that life doesn't have to be big to be beautiful. So, as I sat there, eating my soup and marveling at the fact that I had just cheered on a microwave, I couldn't help but smile. Sure, it's all a little absurd, but maybe that's the point. What about you? What's the most absurdly delightful part of your day? The first thing you need to know is that I don't usually steal shopping carts. I'm not that kind of person, but on that particular Thursday, life had me backed into a corner, and the cart was the only way out. It started with my neighbor, Mr. Crenshaw. He's 87, smells like mothballs, and always wears a tweed jacket even when it's 90 degrees outside. He'd caught me on my way out the door, clutching his little poodle, Muffin, who was wearing what could only be described as a dog-sized sweater vest. "Can you help me?" he wheezed, like he'd been running a marathon instead of standing 2 feet away from his front door. "Muffin needs her favorite snacks, but my hip," he gestured vaguely at his leg, which, as far as I could tell, looked perfectly functional. Now, I have a problem saying no to old people. Blame it on some unresolved guilt about not calling my grandma enough. But before I knew it, I was nodding like a fool. "Sure, Mr. Crenshaw, what does Muffin need?" He handed me a list, a handwritten list, in cursive. It was, in short, a manifesto of Muffin's dietary needs: organic turkey-flavored treats, grain-free kibble, and a very specific brand of peanut butter that, judging by the name, sounded like it was handcrafted by monks in a Himalayan cave. "She'll cry if she doesn't have the peanut butter," he said gravely, as if the emotional well-being of his sweater dog was the keystone holding the universe together. So, off I went to the nearest pet store, which was inconveniently located about 2 miles away. I didn't have my car because it was in the shop, thanks to a particularly vengeful pothole, and the public bus was on some kind of "we'll get there when we get there" schedule. But I was determined. For Muffin, I walked into the store, found everything on the list, no small feat, given that the peanut butter was apparently stored in some mystical backroom, and lugged it all to the register. That's when I hit my first problem. The total was $83.79. For dog food. Is there, like, a discount for neighbors doing charity work? I asked the cashier, a teenager with purple hair who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She just blinked at me. "What?" "Never mind." I paid, praying Mr. Crenshaw would reimburse me, and shoved everything into a bag that immediately started digging into my shoulder like it was trying to cut off my arm. By the time I got outside, it was clear I wasn't making it home without significant collateral damage to my dignity. And that's when I saw it, the shopping cart. It was sitting there in the parking lot, gleaming in the sunlight like some divine intervention from the gods of retail. No one was around. No one would miss it. I told myself I wasn't stealing it. I was borrowing it. For Muffin. For the greater good. So, I wheeled the cart out of the lot and onto the sidewalk, feeling like some kind of low-budget action hero. And that's when things got complicated. About halfway home, the cart started rattling like it was possessed. One of the wheels, naturally, the front left one, decided to rebel, locking up every few feet and making me look like I was wrestling an angry metal bull. People on the street started staring. A kid pointed and whispered to his mom, "Why is that lady pushing a cart full of dog food?" I ignored them and kept going. But then, as I approached the big intersection near my apartment, I heard it, the unmistakable whine of a police siren. No, 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 no. A patrol car slowed to a crawl beside me, and the officer rolled down his window. He was young, with a face that suggested he'd rather be dealing with literally anything else. "Ma'am," he said, his tone hovering somewhere between bored and suspicious, "is that your cart?" I froze. This was it. The moment my life turned into a cautionary tale. "I'm just borrowing it," I said quickly, which I realize now is exactly what someone who is stealing a shopping cart would say. "It's for my neighbor's dog." He raised an eyebrow. "For the dog?" "Yes. Muffin. She's a poodle." He stared at me for a long moment, and I swear I could see him deciding whether this situation was worth the paperwork. Finally, he sighed. "Just get it back to the store when you're done, okay?" I nodded so hard I probably looked like a bobblehead, and he drove off, leaving me to finish my journey of shame. By the time I got to Mr. Crenshaw's, I was drenched in sweat. My hands were raw from gripping the cart, and my pride was in tatters. "Here," I said, dropping the bags at his feet. "Everything Muffin could ever want." Mr. Crenshaw beamed like I delivered the Holy Grail. "Oh, bless you. Muffin's been so anxious lately. This will help her spirits immensely." I nodded, too tired to say anything else, and turned to leave. But just as I was heading down the hall, he called after me. "Oh, wait. I have something for you." He handed me a tin of cookies, homemade, judging by the uneven shapes. "A little thank you," he said. I walked home with that tin in my hands, the cart abandoned in the lobby like a relic of a battle hard fought. I collapsed on my couch, ate 3 cookies in a row, and realized something surprising. They were the best cookies I'd ever had. Soft, buttery, just the right amount of sweetness. And in that moment, I couldn't stop laughing. I'd spent an entire afternoon hauling gourmet dog food across the city, almost got arrested, and ruined a perfectly good pair of sneakers, all for some cookies I hadn't even asked for. So, yeah, sometimes life hands you ridiculousness. Sometimes you steal a shopping cart, but every now and then, it gives you cookies. Ever have a moment like that? Where everything feels absurd and you're not sure if you should cry or laugh, but somehow it all balances out. Or is that just me, risking jail time for a dog named Muffin? Okay, so I have this habit, or maybe it's a coping mechanism. Either way, when I have a crush on someone, I don't just get butterflies or blush when they're around. I start living in a parallel universe where they are unquestionably my soulmate, and we're in the middle of some wild, dramatic love story that the rest of the world is too boring to notice. The thing is, it's not just your run-of-the-mill romantic daydreams. No, my brain decides that every single interaction we have, no matter how mundane, is dripping with hidden meaning. Like, I will take the most random, innocent moment and spin it into an intricate web of destiny. Case in point, a couple of months ago, I had a crush on this guy who worked at the same co-working space as me. We didn't even know each other's names. We were just on a nod-in-the-hallway basis. But one day, we were both in the shared kitchen area at the same time, reaching for coffee mugs. Our hands brushed, not in the romantic, accidental touch way, but in the awkward, "I'm holding the mug and you're also holding the mug" way. Normal people would have said, "Oh, sorry," and moved on. Me? Oh, I was already composing the wedding vows. In my head, this wasn't just two strangers fumbling over a ceramic mug. It was the beginning of everything. I decided that this was the meet-cute from every rom-com ever written. The mug was now a sacred object in our love story, proof that fate had brought us together. I even started calling it our mug in my head. I'd pass by the kitchen later, see it sitting in the sink, and think, wow, there it is, our little ceramic symbol of destiny. It didn't matter that he had no idea who I was, or that he was probably just trying to caffeinate his Monday like a normal person. To me, we were already in Act 1 of a slow-burn romance. This kind of thing happens every time I like someone. My crushes turn into full-blown sagas, where the universe is constantly sending signs that we're meant to be. There was this girl in my yoga class who always rolled her mat up with the exact same meticulous care, and for some reason, my brain decided that this meant she was secretly the love of my life. I convinced myself that the fact we both liked yoga at the same time, on the same day of the week, in the same studio, was a cosmic alignment. I even started showing up to class earlier and earlier, just to sit near the door and see if she'd choose a mat spot closer to me. When she finally did one day, I nearly passed out from the sheer adrenaline. Never mind that the studio was crowded and it was probably the only space left. No, this was the stuff of destiny. But here's where it gets really weird. I have a tendency to overinterpret completely random things as messages from the universe about my crush. Like, if I'm thinking about them and the streetlights flicker, clearly, the universe is winking at me, saying, yes, this is your person. If I overhear a stranger say their name in a coffee shop, obviously, that's not a coincidence. It's fate screaming at me. I once saw a cloud that vaguely resembled the first letter of a guy's name, and I genuinely thought, well, that's it. I've got to marry him now. It doesn't stop there. Whenever I like someone, I also create these bizarre little challenges for myself to prove our connection. Like, if I can walk all the way home without stepping on a single crack in the sidewalk, it means they're thinking about me. Or, if I can guess the next song on my playlist, it means we're meant to be together. And look, I know these are just random games my brain invents to avoid having to, actually talk to the person, but they feel so real in the moment. It's like I've handed over my romantic fate to the whims of sidewalk cracks and Spotify shuffle. One time, it went way too far. I had this massive crush on a bartender at my favorite local spot. He was charming in that effortlessly scruffy way, like he knew he was good-looking but didn't care. I decided that if he remembered my drink order 3 times in a row, it was a sign we were destined for each other. The first 2 times, he nailed it. Whiskey sour, light on the sugar. By the 3rd visit, I was practically vibrating with anticipation, but instead of saying, whiskey sour, like he had before, he just looked at me and said, what'll it be? My stomach dropped like I was in a telenovela, and I went home genuinely wondering if I just ruined my one chance at true love by not being more memorable. Here's the kicker. None of these crushes ever go anywhere because I'm too busy analyzing potential signs of destiny to actually interact with the person. It's like I've convinced myself that if fate really wants us to be together, it'll just make it happen without me having to do anything. But of course, that's not how life works. I've missed so many opportunities because I was too caught up in my own imaginary version of events to take a real step forward. But sometimes, just sometimes, it feels like the universe does play along. Like the time I went to this bookstore cafe and ended up sitting across from this cute stranger who was reading the exact same book as me. I thought, okay, this has to mean something. And for once, I actually said something out loud. I pointed at his book and said, great choice. He smiled, held up his coffee cup like a toast, and said, ditto. We spent the next hour talking about the book, and by the end of it, we'd swap numbers. It didn't turn into a grand love affair, but for that one afternoon, it felt like my ridiculous belief in signs had been validated. So yeah, that's my quirk. When I like someone, the entire world turns into a rom-com set, and every coincidence becomes a love note from the universe. Is it absurd? Absolutely. But honestly, it makes having a crush feel magical, even if it's all in my head. What about you? Do you have any weird little rituals or quirks when it comes to love? Please tell me I'm not the only one out here looking for hidden messages in sidewalk cracks and coffee mugs. There I was, sitting in one of those sticky plastic chairs, scrolling through my phone while my clothes did their spin cycle thing. The place was as boring as ever. Flickering fluorescent lights, an old lady yelling at the dryer for eating her socks, and a vending machine full of expired snacks. Just your typical Tuesday night. And then, out of nowhere, my washer stopped mid-cycle and let out this thunk so loud, I actually jumped. Now, I've been around enough busted appliances to know when one's about to give up on life. So I walked over, ready to wrestle my damp clothes into another machine. But when I opened the washer, instead of my laundry, I found a perfectly folded white envelope sitting on top of what looked like a glowing golden key. For a second, I just stood there, blinking like an idiot. The key was straight out of a fantasy novel, shiny, intricate, with strange symbols etched into its surface. And the envelope? It had my name on it. My full name, which was creepy enough, considering the laundromat regulars didn't strike me as the letter-writing type. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a dryer and yell, "Gotcha!" But no one was paying attention. The old lady was still arguing with the dryer, and the vending machine guy was swearing at a stuck bag of chips. So, I did what any curious, dumb person would do. I grabbed the envelope, opened it, and read the note inside. It said, "You have been chosen. Turn the key to find the path. But beware, every choice has a cost." I snorted, because obviously someone was messing with me. A scavenger hunt? Some guerrilla marketing stunt? Either way, I wasn't in the mood. I tossed the key back into the washer and slammed the door. Except, the washer didn't close. The key wouldn't let it. It just floated there, hovering an inch above the wet pile of my gym clothes, glowing brighter than ever. Fine. I picked it up again, half expecting it to shock me or something. But no, it just hummed softly in my hand, warm like it had been sitting in the sun. And then I noticed something else. On the wall, just above the row of dryers, was a small, round keyhole that I swear hadn't been there 2 minutes ago. I knew I should have walked away, just gone home, folded my towels, and written this off as someone else's weird day. But no, like a moth to a flame, or a dumbass to a glowing key, I walked over and slid it into the lock. The moment the key turned, the entire laundromat shifted. 1 second I was standing on grimy tiles surrounded by detergent fumes, and the next, I was standing in the middle of a massive hall made entirely of mirrors. When I say mirrors, I don't mean a couple of walls here and there. I mean everything. The floor, the ceiling, the pillars lining the room. All of it reflected infinitely, stretching out into forever. The light was soft and golden, but there was no obvious source. It felt like standing inside a giant kaleidoscope, except the only thing it was reflecting was me. And not just one version of me. Dozens of them, hundreds even, scattered across the reflections. Some were wearing outfits I didn't own. Others looked older or younger. One was holding a sword, for some reason, while another was juggling apples. But they all moved when I moved, perfectly in sync, like a creepy, multi-dimensional dance. Before I could freak out, a voice echoed through the hall, deep and calm, like the kind of narrator you'd hear in a movie trailer. "Welcome, Seeker. You have unlocked the Hall of Choices." "Okay," I said, spinning around to find the source of the voice. "This is definitely a prank, right? Is there a camera crew somewhere? Am I on one of those weird reality shows?" The voice ignored me. "Each reflection shows a version of yourself, a life you could have lived. Step forward, and the path will open." That's when I noticed it. In the mirror directly in front of me, my reflection was holding something I wasn't. A shimmering silver door handle, glowing faintly in the glass. I reached out, and when my hand touched the mirror, the glass rippled like water. Now, I know what you're thinking. Don't touch the weird glowing thing, idiot. But in my defense, the voice had this way of making you feel like you were supposed to. Like it would be rude not to. So, of course, I stepped forward. The mirror swallowed me whole. I stumbled out onto a cobblestone street, the smell of freshly baked bread and lavender in the air. Around me, the city hummed with life. But it wasn't like any city I'd ever seen. The buildings were tall and curved, their walls covered in ivy that shimmered like emeralds. People bustled past in colorful robes, carrying baskets of glowing fruit or leading animals that looked suspiciously like six-legged llamas. And here's the kicker. Everyone I passed greeted me like they knew me. "Morning, Captain," someone called. "The council meeting went well, I hope," said another. A little kid tugged at my sleeve and handed me a shiny coin before running off, giggling. I stopped to look at my reflection in a shop window and almost didn't recognize myself. I was taller, sharper somehow, dressed in sleek armor with a cloak that billowed behind me, even though there wasn't any wind. A sword hung at my side, the hilt etched with runes that glowed faintly as I moved. Before I could process any of it, a hand clapped me on the shoulder. I turned to see a grinning man with wild hair and a staff that crackled with lightning. "Captain," he said, "the portal's destabilizing again. We'll need your help at the spire." Sure," I said, because what else was I supposed to say? As he dragged me through the streets, I realized something. This wasn't a dream, and it wasn't just a random version of me. This was a choice. Somewhere deep down, I knew that if I wanted, I could stay here, be the captain, lead the people, wield the sword. But then I remembered the note. Every choice has a cost. What would I lose if I stayed? My old life? My friends? My dog Moose? I didn't know. And the longer I walked, the harder it became to think straight. Like the city itself was pulling at me, whispering, "You belong here." So, when we reached the spire, a massive tower of glass and light stretching into the clouds, I stopped. The man looked back at me, confused. I can't," I said, stepping away. His grin faltered, but he didn't argue. "The hall always gives a choice," he said softly. "If this isn't yours, then go." I turned and ran, ignoring the way the city seemed to shimmer with disappointment. I found my way back to the mirror, the glass rippling as I stepped through. And just like that, I was back in the laundromat. The washer beeped cheerfully, like nothing had happened. The key and note were gone. My clothes were dry. I don't know what that was, or why it happened. But sometimes, I think about that other version of me, the captain, and I wonder, did I make the right choice? If you found a door that could lead you to another version of your life, would you walk through? Would you stay? Or would you come back? It began with the envelope. A plain, unmarked envelope sitting in my mailbox, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a dentist reminder card. There was no name, no address, just an odd seal on the back. A crescent moon cradling a tiny star, pressed into deep red wax. At first, I assumed it was junk mail or some strange promotional stunt, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it as soon as I got inside. Inside was a single card, its surface as black as obsidian, and written on it in delicate silver script were 4 words. "Your journey begins tonight." No signature, no instructions, no explanation. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for some sense of rationality to creep in. Maybe it was a prank, I thought, though I couldn't imagine who would go to such lengths. I flipped the card over, half expecting a QR code or website link, but the back was blank. Eventually, I tossed it on the counter and went about my evening, trying to ignore the gnawing unease it left behind. But when midnight rolled around, everything changed. I was sitting in bed, scrolling on my phone, when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. A second later, my phone screen cut to black, too. Just as I was about to curse the power outage, I heard it, a faint knock at the window. Now, I live on the 3rd floor. My heart nearly stopped. For a moment, I told myself it must have been the wind, maybe a branch hitting the glass. But when I glanced toward the window, I saw it. Something. A figure. It was silhouetted against the faint glow of moonlight, tall and angular, with long limbs and an unervingly graceful posture. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of something that shouldn't have been there. I froze, clutching my blanket like it would somehow protect me. The figure raised a hand and tapped the window again, the sound sharper this time, more deliberate. Against all logic, I got up and moved toward it. As I approached, the figure tilted its head, as if studying me. Then it raised a hand and pointed to the door. I don't know why I obeyed. Every instinct screamed at me to lock myself in the bathroom and call the cops. but something about the figure was magnetic, impossible to resist. I grabbed my coat, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. The building was eerily quiet. The dim emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows, and the air smelled faintly of rain, though the weather had been clear all day. I glanced back toward my apartment, half expecting the door to slam shut behind me, but it didn't. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, where there should have been a wall, there was now an archway. It was massive, carved from stone that glowed faintly with an inner light. Runes I couldn't read spiraled along its surface, and through it, I could see a swirling expanse of stars, as if the night sky had been unraveled and woven into a tapestry. I don't remember walking toward it. One moment I was standing there, staring, and the next I was stepping through. The world beyond the archway was impossible. The ground beneath my feet wasn't solid, but it held me all the same. A surface of shimmering light that rippled like water with every step. Above me, the sky was a chaotic masterpiece of colors, hues I didn't even have names for, moving in patterns that seemed alive. In the distance, massive structures floated, their shapes constantly shifting. One moment a towering spire, the next a cluster of orbs suspended by invisible strings. And then there were the beings. They weren't human, though some of them were close. One figure, impossibly tall and draped in robes that seemed to be made of liquid shadow, walked past me without a glance. Another, a creature with crystalline wings and a face that seemed to refract light, hovered a few feet above the ground, humming a melody that made my chest ache. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt invited, like I'd stumbled into a dream I was always meant to see. Welcome. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonant and soothing. I turned to see a woman, or at least, something resembling one, standing before me. Her eyes were galaxies, swirling with stars and nebulas, and her hair flowed as though caught in an eternal breeze. "You've come," she said, her voice both familiar and alien. Where am I?" I stammered. "The in-between," she replied, smiling faintly. "A place of transition, of possibility. Few are chosen to walk its paths, but you." She tilted her head, studying me. "You've been called." "Called for what?" "To choose." Before I could ask what she meant, she raised her hand, and the world around us shifted. Suddenly, I was standing on a precipice, overlooking two paths. One glowed with golden light, lined with shimmering trees that whispered secrets I couldn't quite hear. The other was darker, its path winding into shadow, lit only by the faint flicker of distant flames. "These are the choices before you," the woman said. "One leads to certainty, a life of comfort and familiarity. The other," her voice trailed off, and her gaze lingered on the shadowed path. "The other leads to the unknown, to risk, to wonder. What happens if I choose wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. "There is no wrong choice," she said simply. "Only the one you're ready to make." I stood there for what felt like hours, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The golden path was safe, welcoming, a promise of peace. But the shadowed path, something about it pulled at me, a whisper of adventure, of answers I didn't even know I was seeking. Finally, I stepped forward, toward the shadowed path. The woman's smile widened, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw approval in her galaxy-filled eyes. "Good," she said softly. "Then your journey begins." The ground shifted beneath me, and the world fell away in a rush of color and sound. The last thing I heard was her voice, faint and echoing. "May you find what you seek." When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, the envelope still on the counter. But something had changed. On the back of the card, new words had appeared, glowing faintly in silver. "The first step is always the hardest. Keep going." Have you ever felt like the universe itself was giving you a nudge, daring you to step off the beaten path? When Marcus first saw the box, it was sitting in the middle of the street like it had been dropped by a careless hand. It was unremarkable at first glance, just a plain, cardboard cube, about the size of a small microwave, sealed with a strip of translucent tape. The odd thing, though, was the way people avoided it. Cars swerved around it without honking. Cyclists crossed to the other side of the road, and a man walking his dog gave it a wide berth, tugging on the leash as if the box radiated some unseen force. Marcus stood at the curb, his grocery bag digging into his wrist. The box wasn't threatening. It was just sitting there. Yet he felt the hairs on his arms stand up as though it had whispered his name. Nobody else seemed willing to go near it, and the thought of leaving it alone prickled at Marcus's brain like an itch he couldn't scratch. Without fully deciding, he set down his groceries, stepped off the curb, and walked toward the box. It had no labels, no shipping information. The tape glinted faintly under the afternoon sun, as though it had been sealed only moments ago. Marcus crouched beside it and hesitated. "Don't," said a voice from behind him. He turned to see an old woman sitting on a nearby bench, her face hidden beneath the wide brim of a faded straw hat. Her knobby hands gripped the handle of a cane, and her milky eyes were fixed not on him, but on the box. "Why not?" Marcus asked, his voice cautious. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her words were slow, deliberate. "It's not meant to be opened." Marcus chuckled nervously. "It's just a box." "It's not just anything," she replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It waits for someone like you." Marcus didn't know what that meant, but something in her tone made his mouth dry. Still, curiosity burned hotter than the warning. He glanced back at the box, his fingers brushing the edge of the tape. The air shifted. It wasn't a breeze, more like the sensation of the room holding its breath. For a moment, the street around him went silent. No cars, no birds, no footsteps, just him and the box. "Suit yourself," the woman muttered, standing shakily from the bench. She shuffled away, her cane tapping against the pavement. "Don't say you weren't warned." Marcus peeled back the tape. The box opened with a soft hiss, like a sigh escaping a long-sealed tomb. Inside was nothing, just an empty void that seemed too dark, too deep, for a space so small. He tilted it toward the light, but the shadows inside refused to yield. He reached in, his hand trembling. The instant his fingers crossed the threshold, the world tilted. His vision blurred, colors running like wet paint, and a high-pitched ringing filled his ears. He yanked his hand back, but it was too late. The street was gone. He was standing in a vast, endless field of gray mist, the ground beneath him soft and shifting like ash. Above him, the sky was an oppressive shade of black, punctuated by faint, flickering lights that didn't behave like stars. They moved, fast and erratic, like insects trapped in a jar. The box sat at his feet, now larger, its edges frayed as though it had aged centuries in an instant. The void inside was still there, still hungry. "What is this?" Marcus whispered, his breath visible in the cold, stale air. "This is the in-between," said a voice, deep and resonant. It came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in his bones. Marcus spun around, but saw no one. "Who's there?" The mist shifted, coalescing into a figure. It was tall, impossibly so, and humanoid only in the vaguest sense. Its body seemed to flicker between solid and smoke, and its eyes burned like twin coals. "You opened the box," it said, its voice as heavy as a cathedral bell. "And now you belong to it." "I didn't mean to," Marcus stammered, stepping back. "I didn't. What does that mean?" The figure tilted its head, as though amused. "The box is a key, a gate, a burden. You have taken it upon yourself." Marcus shook his head. No, I'll put it back. I'll close it, leave it there." "It does not work that way," the figure interrupted. "The box is yours now, and so is the curse." Marcus's chest tightened. "Curse?" The figure's form shifted, elongating, its voice growing softer but no less chilling. "You are its keeper, its guardian. You must carry it, for it carries you." Before Marcus could protest, the box began to move. The cardboard peeled away like skin, revealing a pulsating, black mass beneath. It rose into the air, spinning slowly, tendrils of shadow curling out like grasping fingers. Marcus stumbled back as the tendrils shot toward him, wrapping around his arms, his legs, his chest. "No!" he screamed, struggling against the impossible pull. The tendrils didn't hurt, but they claimed him, seeping into his skin, binding him to the box in ways he couldn't understand but felt deeply in his soul. The figure watched him passively. There is no escape, only the path forward. Marcus's vision blurred again, the mist swallowing him whole. When he opened his eyes, he was back on the street, the box now a faint, dark tattoo on his forearm, its shape twisting as though alive. The woman on the bench was gone. The cars and people were moving as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The box whispered to him now, quiet, insistent, demanding. And Marcus knew, deep down, that wherever he went, it would follow. The day began with a letter. Not the kind of letter that gets lost in a stack of bills or grocery store ads. This one was tucked under my front door, sealed with red wax and embossed with a symbol I didn't recognize. It had no address, no stamp, and no name on the outside. Just the envelope, heavy and slightly warm, as if it had been sitting too close to a fire. I opened it before I even made it to the kitchen for coffee. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, and in the center, written in looping, elegant handwriting, were 3 words. Come find me. There was no signature, no explanation, but the moment I touched the paper, the air around me seemed to change. It felt charged, like the silence before a thunderstorm. My skin prickled, and an odd thought crept into my head. What if this is for real? On instinct, I flipped the letter over. In the corner, barely visible, was a symbol, a small, intricate spiral, like a maze. Before I could think too hard about it, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from an unknown number. Check your pocket. I froze. My heart thudded against my ribs as I slid my hand into my jeans pocket. It was empty, until it wasn't. A coin appeared in my hand, cool and heavy, though I swore I hadn't put anything there. The spiral symbol was etched onto its surface. The text buzzed again. Drop the coin into water. Okay, I said out loud, half expecting someone to answer. No one did. It should have ended there. A weird morning prank, a coincidence. But something about the coin felt too solid, too intentional. Against my better judgment, I filled a bowl with water and dropped the coin in. The moment it hit the surface, the world shifted. The room melted away like a painting under heavy rain, the walls dripping into streaks of color. I blinked, and suddenly I was standing on a cobblestone street under a twilight sky. The air smelled like lavender and old books, and a warm wind carried the distant hum of music. Above me, constellations I didn't recognize sparkled like scattered jewels. The street stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with buildings that seemed to defy logic. One was impossibly tall, spiraling up into the sky like a coiled ribbon. Another looked like it had been stitched together from pieces of different houses, wood, brick, even glass, and glowed faintly from within. A street lamp nearby flickered to life, casting a soft golden light. At the base of the street lamp was another letter, propped against the pole. This one wasn't sealed. I picked it up, half expecting it to burst into flames or vanish in my hands. Instead, it simply read, "Welcome. You have until midnight." Until midnight for what? And who had brought me here? My mind spun with questions, but there was no one around to answer them. The street was eerily empty, except for the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. I chose a direction and started walking. The first building I passed had a door that shimmered like a soap bubble, and etched above it were the words "A Library of Forgotten Stories." Inside, shelves stretched as far as the eye could see, each filled with books that seemed to glow faintly, as if they were alive. A woman sat behind a desk, her hair braided with tiny lights that blinked in and out like fireflies. She looked up when I entered. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she said, frowning slightly. "Where is here?" I asked, holding up the letter. Her eyes softened when she saw it. You've been invited. That changes things." She pointed to the far end of the library. "The answers you need are at the end of the street, but don't linger. Midnight comes quickly." I wanted to ask more, but the look in her eyes told me she wouldn't explain. So I stepped back outside, clutching the letter tightly. The footsteps I'd heard earlier were louder now, though I still couldn't see anyone. The air around me felt heavier, like the street itself was holding its breath. As I walked, the buildings became stranger. One had no doors, just windows that flickered with scenes of people's lives, some joyful, others heartbreakingly lonely. Another pulsed like it was alive, its walls expanding and contracting with each breath. A carousel spun in the middle of the road, its riders nothing more than shadows. Every step I took felt like peeling back a layer of a dream. Then I saw it. The spiral, the same symbol from the letter and the coin, engraved on a massive black door at the end of the street. It loomed over me, impossibly tall, its surface rippling like liquid obsidian. The footsteps behind me stopped. I turned slowly. A figure stood a few paces away, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see their face, but their presence pressed against me like a weight. They raised an arm and pointed at the door. "You're almost out of time," they said, their voice low and resonant. "If you don't step through, the chance will be lost forever." "What's behind it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Everything you've forgotten, and everything you've yet to discover." Something about their words sparked a memory I couldn't quite grasp, like an itch in the back of my mind. I turned to the door, and the spiral on its surface began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "What happens if I don't go through?" I asked, but when I turned back, the figure was gone. My hand hovered over the door, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. I thought about the coin, the letters, the strange and wondrous street. Every piece had led me here, to this moment, and something inside me, something buried deep, whispered that this was where I was meant to be. I pushed the door open. The world beyond it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't another street or city or even another world. It was mine. Memories spilled out like floodwaters. A childhood daydream of running through endless fields, the way sunlight filtered through my grandmother's curtains, the thrill of holding a book I couldn't wait to read. And in between, glimpses of places I didn't recognize but felt I'd always known. A vast desert under twin moons, a mountain that sang when the wind blew through its peaks. I stepped through, and the door vanished behind me. I was back in my apartment, the compass resting on my kitchen counter, its needle spinning lazily again. But I knew I wasn't the same. The letter's final words echoed in my mind. "Come find me." Wherever me was, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. I'd arrived at the small bookstore where we'd agreed to meet. A quirky, hole-in-the-wall place with mismatched furniture and shelves that looked like they might collapse under the weight of too many paperbacks. I glanced around, scanning for him, but instead of finding his face, I found an envelope taped to the inside of the door. My name was written on it in blocky, uneven handwriting. I peeled it off, curious, and opened it to find a single sheet of paper inside. "Welcome to the first clue of the evening. If you're game, find the book that starts it all. Hint, it's something by Austen, and it might be prideful." I couldn't help but laugh. A scavenger hunt? On a date? Bold move. I tucked the note into my bag and headed for the classics section, weaving through the narrow aisles and trying not to knock over any precariously stacked books. There it was, Pride and Prejudice, sitting on a low shelf, with another envelope tucked between its pages. The second note read, "So you found it. Impressive. Next step, look for a book about dragons, but not just any dragons. Think fire, blood, and iron thrones. Meet me there." By now, my curiosity was fully piqued. I wandered to the fantasy section, scanning the shelves until I spotted a copy of A Game of Thrones. And there he was, leaning casually against the shelf like he hadn't just orchestrated the nerdiest, most charming date setup I'd ever seen. "You made it," he said, grinning like he'd just solved a puzzle himself. He had this disheveled look, jeans, a black hoodie, and hair that seemed permanently stuck in, just rolled out of bed mode. But there was an ease about him, like he'd planned this but wasn't taking it too seriously. "You didn't think I'd quit after one clue, did you?" I teased, holding up the note. "Of course not. But now comes the fun part." He held up a basket filled with blank cards and a small Polaroid camera. "Want to make a story?" I raised an eyebrow. "A story?" "Yeah," he said, pulling out a card. "We each pick 5 random books from the shelves, take a picture of their covers, and then write a ridiculous plot tying them all together. Bonus points if it involves pirates or time travel. I burst out laughing. It was so unexpected, so weird, and yet so perfectly him. Without hesitation, I grabbed a book with a neon pink cover that screamed bad romance and tossed it into the basket. You're on. The next hour flew by in a blur of laughter and whispered debates over which books were worthy of our imaginary epic. I grabbed a sci-fi novel about alien invasions, while he added a vintage cookbook called The Serve Man, which he insisted was about cannibalism. At one point, we both lunged for a biography of Winston Churchill at the same time, collapsing into a fit of giggles when we realized neither of us actually wanted it. We just liked the challenge of working it into our absurd storyline. When we finally sat down at a wobbly table in the corner, surrounded by stacks of books and a smattering of Polaroids, our plot was an unhinged masterpiece. It involved a time-traveling pirate chef who accidentally starts an intergalactic war when he tries to cater a diplomatic summit between aliens and 18th-century British royalty. I accused him of stealing the best jokes, and he countered by claiming I was hogging all the good plot twists. By the end, we were laughing so hard that the bookstore clerk kept shooting us side eyes. And then, just as we were wrapping up our story, he looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You're fun, you know that?" It was such a simple thing to say, but the way he said it made my heart do this weird, fluttery thing. Like he wasn't just talking about the date, he was talking about me. We didn't stop at the bookstore. Afterward, he suggested walking to a nearby food truck that sold churros. Best churros in the city, he claimed, though I strongly suspected he just really wanted churros. We ate them sitting on the hood of his car, powdered sugar dusting our fingers, and our conversation drifting from our favorite childhood books to which fictional characters we'd want on our zombie apocalypse team. He picked Gandalf, which I argued was cheating, but he said all's fair in love and zombie survival. The night ended in the parking lot, the city quiet around us. He leaned against the car, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and smiled at me in that easy, effortless way of his. "So," he said, "was this the nerdiest date you've ever been on?" "By far," I replied, "but also the best." "Good," he said, his grin turning a little softer, "because I already have ideas for the sequel." I laughed, shaking my head as I fished the Polaroids out of my bag. "Well, we're definitely publishing this first. I think the world needs to know about our time-traveling pirate chef." He laughed, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us felt light but significant, like something had shifted without either of us acknowledging it. When I got home that night, I found a note tucked into my bag, written on the back of one of the Polaroids. Plot twist: the best part of tonight wasn't the books. It was you. It wasn't the kind of line I'd normally fall for, but somehow, coming from him, it felt perfect. Unexpected, playful, and genuine. Just like the whole night. Have you ever been on a date so unique it felt like stepping into a story you didn't want to end? The rain didn't start with a drizzle. It came all at once, a torrential downpour that made the streetlights flicker like they were struggling to stay alive. I hadn't meant to be out this late, but the universe seemed determined to make me its punchline that night. My car wouldn't start, my phone battery was dead, and now I was drenched, standing in front of a bookstore that looked like it belonged in another century. Its sign was faded, the letters barely legible in the rain, but the warm glow spilling out from the windows was enough to pull me inside. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped in, the sound oddly delicate for a place that smelled like dust and forgotten memories. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves that towered toward a ceiling I couldn't see. Books were crammed into every possible space, stacked on tables, teetering on chairs, even spilling onto the floor in haphazard piles. It was the kind of chaos that felt deliberate, as if the store had been curated not by a librarian, but by a poet with too many thoughts and not enough time. "Late for browsing," a voice said, startling me. Behind the counter sat an old man with a face like crumpled parchment. He wore a cardigan that looked older than the store itself and held a mug of something steaming. His eyes, sharp and bright despite his age, flicked over me like he was assessing whether I was worth the effort of conversation. "My car broke down," I said, brushing rain from my jacket. "I just needed somewhere to wait out the storm." He nodded slowly, like that explained everything. "Feel free to look around then." Books have a way of finding the right people at the right time. I gave him a polite smile and wandered deeper into the store, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The shelves seemed endless, stretching into corners that defied the building's exterior dimensions. As I walked, the titles caught my eye, not just because they were unfamiliar, but because they were odd. The House That Remembers You. Echoes of a Future Forgotten. To those who still listen. Each one felt strangely personal, like the books were trying to tell me something. I was drawn to a small table tucked into the back of the store, where a single book lay open as if waiting for me. Its cover was unmarked, a deep, inky black that seemed to absorb the light around it. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder to see if the old man was watching, but he was still at the counter, sipping his drink and flipping through a magazine. Slowly, I reached out and turned the page. The text inside wasn't printed. It was handwritten, the ink looping and curling like the writer had been in a hurry. But it wasn't the handwriting that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the words. They were mine. Not words I'd written, but thoughts I'd had, memories I'd buried so deeply I wasn't even sure they were real anymore. A childhood argument with my sister. The first time I felt truly alone. A secret I'd told no one, not even myself, but here it was, scrawled across the page like the book had pulled it straight from my soul. What the hell is this? I muttered, snapping the book shut. That one's a bit nosy, isn't it? The old man's voice said behind me. I turned sharply, clutching the book like it might vanish if I let go. He stood a few feet away, leaning on a cane I hadn't noticed before. Despite the warmth of the store, his presence sent a chill down my spine. How does it know these things? I demanded. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. Books like that are peculiar. They show you what you need to see, not what you want to. I didn't ask to see any of this. No one does, he said, his tone softening. But that doesn't mean it isn't important. I glanced back at the book, my fingers brushing over its cover. A part of me wanted to drop it and run, to put as much distance between myself and this strange place as possible. But another part of me, a quieter, more insistent part, knew that if I left now, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what was on the next page. What happens if I keep reading? I asked. The old man tilted his head, considering me. That depends. Are you the kind of person who finishes what they start? I swallowed hard, the weight of the question settling over me. Without answering, I turned back to the book and opened it again. The words on the next page were different, less like memories and more like a map. They described a place I didn't recognize but somehow knew. A forest with trees so tall they blotted out the sky, a clearing bathed in silver light, a door carved into the trunk of an ancient oak. My pulse quickened as the description grew more vivid, the words pulling me in until I could almost smell the moss and hear the rustle of leaves. And then, at the bottom of the page, a single line stood out. You'll know it when you find it. What does this mean? I asked, looking up, but the old man was gone. The store was silent now, the air heavy and still. I called out, but my voice seemed to vanish into the endless rows of books. A prickling sense of unease crept over me, but it wasn't enough to stop me. Clutching the book, I made my way back toward the door, half expecting it to be locked. But when I pushed it open, the night outside was eerily calm. The rain had stopped, and the streetlights no longer flickered. I stepped outside, and the world shifted. The city was gone, replaced by the forest from the book. The trees loomed above me, their branches tangled like the threads of a web, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and rain. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the book was still in my hands, its pages now blank except for the final line. Keep going. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt strange in that place, stretching and folding in on itself like a story with no beginning or end. Eventually, I reached the clearing, its silver light spilling over me like water. In the center stood the oak, its bark etched with symbols I couldn't read. The door was there, just as the book had described, and as I reached for it, a single thought filled my mind. What happens when I open it? But I already knew the answer. A few years ago, during a particularly brutal summer heat wave, my air conditioner decided to quit on me. I live in one of those aging apartment complexes where the walls are thin, the pipes groan, and the landlord is always on vacation when things go wrong. That day, it was 102 degrees by noon, and my apartment felt like the inside of an oven. So, with sweat running down my back and a growing sense of desperation, I grabbed my keys and decided to escape to the one place that always had reliable AC, the library. The library in my neighborhood wasn't anything special, just a squat brick building with flickering fluorescent lights and a faint smell of old paper. But that day, it felt like a sanctuary. I stepped inside and immediately felt the cool, blessed rush of refrigerated air on my face. A few other heat refugees had gathered there, sprawled in chairs or pretending to read magazines they clearly weren't interested in. I found a seat near the back, close to the oversized books about art and photography, and let out a sigh of relief. For a while, I just sat there, flipping through a random book about impressionist paintings and letting the cold seep into my bones. But then something caught my eye, a small door, almost hidden in the corner of the room. It wasn't a regular door. It was shorter, with a rounded top like something out of a fairy tale. What made it even stranger was the sign above it, written in neat, hand-painted letters, Rare Finds Room. Now, I'd been coming to this library for years, and I'd never noticed that door before. It seemed absurd that something so peculiar had escaped my attention, but there it was, plain as day. A little thrill of curiosity sparked in me. The main library was open plan. You could see everything at a glance. But this door? It felt like a secret. I glanced around. No one seemed to be paying attention. So, I stood up, brushed imaginary dust off my jeans, and walked toward the door like I had every right to be there. There wasn't a knob, just a simple brass latch. I lifted it, half expecting the door to be locked. But it wasn't. It opened with a faint creak, and a cool draft rushed out, carrying with it a strange, woody scent that reminded me of cedar and rain-soaked earth. The room beyond was dimly lit, with shelves that stretched impossibly high, far beyond what the building's exterior should have allowed. There were no fluorescent lights here, only flickering lanterns that cast golden halos of light over the shelves. And the books, oh, the books. They weren't arranged in any particular order. Some were stacked haphazardly, while others leaned against one another like tired travelers. Their spines were a riot of textures and colors, leather, fabric, paper, and most of them bore no titles at all. I stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft click. The air here was cooler, heavier, as though the room itself was holding its breath. For a moment, I hesitated. There was something about the space that felt alive, like it was watching me. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. I turned, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and I realized it wasn't a voice. It was a book. One of the books on the nearest shelf had fallen open, its pages fluttering like wings in a breeze I couldn't feel. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite the growing knot of unease in my chest. The pages were filled with a script I didn't recognize, delicate, looping letters that shimmered faintly, like they'd been written with liquid gold. As I reached out to touch the page, the words shifted, rearranging themselves into something I could read. To find what you didn't know you were looking for, turn the page. I froze. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe this was some kind of interactive exhibit or a clever art installation. But the words felt personal, directed at me in a way that sent a shiver down my spine despite the heat outside. Against my better judgment, I turned the page. The moment I did, the room seemed to exhale. The lanterns flickered brighter, and the shelves rearranged themselves with a sound like rustling leaves. The next page was blank, except for a single line at the top. "What have you lost?" I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. It felt like a question I didn't want to answer, but the room was waiting, and some part of me, some deep, instinctual part, knew I couldn't leave until I did. So, I whispered, barely loud enough to hear myself, "I don't know." The book's pages began to turn on their own, faster and faster, until they were a blur of gold and white. Then they stopped, and an image appeared on the open page. It was a photo, though not like any I'd seen before. It was moving, shifting, a memory rendered in perfect clarity. It was me, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on a sunlit porch with a dog I hadn't thought about in years. Shadow, his name was. A mutt with floppy ears and a tail that wagged like it had a motor. He'd been my best friend when I was a kid, my constant companion. And then, one day, he was gone. My parents had told me he ran away, but even as a child, I'd known there was more to the story. I just hadn't wanted to ask. The image faded, and new words appeared. Would you like to know where he went? I didn't answer, but the room seemed to take my silence as a yes. The book snapped shut, and the lanterns dimmed. For a moment, I was plunged into darkness, my heart hammering in my chest. And then the door behind me creaked open, spilling light into the room. When I stepped back into the main library, everything was as it had been. The hum of the air conditioning, the quiet murmur of patrons flipping pages. The rare finds room door was gone. I left the library in a daze, unsure if what I'd experienced was real or some kind of heat-induced hallucination. But that night, I had a dream. I was on the porch again, the sunlight warm on my face. And there was Shadow, wagging his tail, his eyes bright and full of love. He didn't look older, or thinner, or tired. He looked exactly as I remembered him. When I woke up, I felt lighter, like a piece of me that had been missing had clicked back into place. I still don't know what the rare finds room was, or why it showed me what it did. But sometimes, when I walk past the library, I catch a faint whiff of cedar and rain-soaked earth, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to open the door. Have you ever stumbled across something you couldn't explain, something that felt like it was meant just for you? A little crack in the ordinary world where the extraordinary seeped through? I woke up to find my alarm clock knitting a sweater for itself. The clock's hands ticked away steadily as it looped pink yarn around tiny needles. "Don't judge me," it said without looking up. "Mornings are cold, even for clocks." I nodded groggily and swung my legs out of bed, only to find my slippers had turned into goldfish overnight. They flopped around on the carpet, apologizing profusely for the inconvenience. "We didn't mean to," the left slipper, fish, burbled. "It just sort of happened." "It's fine," I said, picking them up gently and dropping them into the nearest potted plant, which had conveniently filled itself with water. The plant, a cheerful fern, waved its fronds in appreciation. "Team effort," it said, giving the goldfish slippers a homey swish of its leaves. When I went to the bathroom, the mirror wasn't reflecting me as much as remixing me. My face appeared in patches, my nose upside down, my mouth on my forehead, my eyes blinking at each other from opposite ends of the glass. "You look abstract today," the mirror said, its voice soft but amused. "Very postmodern. Can you make me less Picasso?" I asked. It sighed dramatically. "If I must." A ripple of light passed across the glass, and my face reassembled itself. Better. Mostly. My left eyebrow was still upside down, but honestly, I kind of liked it. In the kitchen, the toaster was nowhere to be found, and I quickly discovered why. It was outside, standing in the driveway, holding hands with the microwave. "We're eloping," the toaster announced when it saw me. The microwave looked bashful, its buttons flickering nervously. "It's forbidden love," it whispered. I stared at them for a long moment, then shrugged. "Good luck, I guess. Just send me a postcard." As they shuffled down the street together, a passing mailbox tipped its lid in approval. The house, now awake and aware of my movements, decided to add a little spice to my morning routine. The staircase had transformed into a spiral slide, and every step had become a squishy, candy-like substance that smelled faintly of bubblegum. "Whee!" the banister cheered as I slid down, hair whipping into my face. At the bottom, a chorus of voices from the kitchen greeted me. "She's here. She's here." When I stepped in, my appliances were throwing a breakfast party. The blender was spinning in place like a tiny tornado. The fridge was playing a bossa nova tune from somewhere deep in its icy compartments, and my coffee mug had climbed onto the counter to deliver a speech. "Today," it proclaimed, "we honor the great consumer of caffeine, our noble human." The crowd of objects, because apparently even the chairs had joined in, cheered wildly. A spatula tossed confetti made of parsley leaves. I gave an awkward wave and poured myself some coffee, which tasted faintly of applause. Outside, the world was mid-rehearsal for some grand, nonsensical performance. The sky had turned green, a soft, pastel shade that shifted whenever a bird flew across it. Complementary colors, the clouds explained when I asked. A parade of bicycles with no riders passed by, their bells chiming a tune I couldn't quite place. In the park, the squirrels were holding a council meeting, complete with tiny gavels. They sat in a circle beneath an ancient oak tree, chittering in a language that sounded vaguely legal. One squirrel, wearing a bow tie, glanced at me and said, "Excuse us, citizen. This matter is classified." "Carry on," I said, backing away. Further along, a man was walking an invisible dog. Or, at least, I assumed it was invisible until I heard a sharp bark and felt something nip at my shoelace. "Don't mind her," the man said. "She gets feisty around strangers." I looked down to see my shoelace untying itself, apparently of its own volition, and decided not to ask any more questions. In the middle of the park, a group of children was playing a game that didn't seem to have any rules. They were tossing glowing orbs to each other, and every time one of the orbs touched the ground, it burst into a flock of tiny, iridescent butterflies. The butterflies would flutter around for a moment before dissolving back into orbs, ready to be thrown again. "Can I play?" I asked one of the kids. "Sure," she said, handing me an orb. It was warm and pulsing slightly, like a heartbeat in my palm. When I threw it, it soared into the air and exploded into a shower of silver stars that hung suspended, twinkling against the green sky. "Nice one," the girl said, clapping. On my way home, I passed a river that wasn't there yesterday. It was flowing uphill, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. A sign by the bank read, "Warning, strong currents of nostalgia." Curious, I dipped my hand in, and immediately I was flooded with memories. Birthday parties, first kisses, the way my grandmother used to hum while making soup. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart aching in that bittersweet way only nostalgia can manage. The river seemed to giggle softly as it continued its impossible journey upward. When I got back, the house had rearranged itself again. The living room was upside down, the chandelier hanging like a tree from the floor. My goldfish slippers were now performing synchronized swimming routines in the fern's watery fronds. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch to see the moon. It had grown 3 times its usual size and was glowing a soft lavender. Below it, the stars were forming constellations I didn't recognize. One of them looked vaguely like a teapot. As I watched, a shooting star zipped across the sky, leaving behind a trail of shimmering words. "What would you wish for in a world where everything wishes for you, too?" I didn't answer. Instead, I went inside, curled up in bed, and let the galaxy-painted ceiling lull me to sleep, wondering what the world might dream up next. The night sky above the desert was alive, a sweeping canvas of stars that seemed almost close enough to touch. Nadia leaned against the hood of her car, her breath forming faint clouds in the chilly air. The vast emptiness around her felt surreal, as though she had driven off the edge of the map and into a forgotten corner of the world. The notebook lay open on the passenger seat, its pages fluttering in the breeze. She glanced at it again, the coordinates scrawled in a shaky hand, the ink smeared as though written in a hurry. They didn't look like anything special, just numbers, latitude and longitude, disconnected from any larger story. But they'd arrived in her mailbox with no return address and no explanation, just the instructions. Come alone. Midnight. The headlights of her car stretched out in pale beams over the dry, cracked earth. She checked the clock. 11:57. She thought of turning back, of leaving this whole strange night behind her and returning to her quiet apartment, her quiet job, her quiet life. But something about the note had burrowed into her mind, something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the curiosity. It was the handwriting, because she swore she'd seen it before. From someone who shouldn't have been able to write her anything at all. From someone who had been dead for 3 years. She didn't hear the truck until it was almost upon her, its engine a low, guttural growl that cut through the silence like a blade. She turned to see a set of high beams bouncing toward her across the uneven ground, bright and unyielding. Her pulse quickened as the vehicle came to a stop a few yards away. A man climbed out, his figure silhouetted against the glare of his lights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a battered jacket and a hat that obscured most of his face. He stood there for a moment, watching her, and she felt her throat tighten with unease. "Are you Nadia?" he asked, his voice low and steady, with an accent she couldn't place. She nodded, her hands clenching at her sides. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dirt. As he moved into the glow of her headlights, she could see his face more clearly. Rough features, a thick beard streaked with gray, and eyes that seemed to glint unnaturally in the dark. He held up a small black device in his hand, something that looked like a cross between a walkie-talkie and a Geiger counter. It was clicking softly, the way a Geiger counter might. He frowned at it, then at her. "They said you'd come alone," he muttered. She stiffened. "I did." He tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. "Then why does the reading say there's two of you?" She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the device began to click faster. The man's frown deepened, and he took a step back, his hand reaching toward his belt where a sleek, silver weapon was holstered. "Get down," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. She froze, confused, until she saw his eyes dart past her to something behind her car. She turned slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. At first, it looked like a mirage, a distortion in the air, shimmering faintly like heat rising from the ground. But as it moved closer, she could see it more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape shifted constantly, a blur of limbs and spindly protrusions that defied logic. The thing didn't walk so much as glide, its surface rippling like liquid caught in a beam of light, and it was coming straight for her. The man shouted something, but she couldn't hear him over the roar of her own heartbeat. She stumbled backward, her legs unsteady, as the creature stopped just feet away from her. It tilted its head, or at least what she thought might be its head, as though examining her. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then, without warning, it lunged. A flash of light erupted from behind her, followed by a deafening crack. The creature reeled back, its form flickering and distorting as if trying to hold itself together. She turned to see the man holding the silver weapon, a faint trail of smoke rising from its barrel. "Get in the truck," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. She didn't think, didn't argue. She ran. The truck's door slammed shut behind her as the man climbed into the driver's seat and gunned the engine. The creature was already recovering, its body snapping back into focus with a sickening, fluid motion. The truck roared forward, its tires kicking up clouds of dust as it sped across the desert. "What the hell was that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The man didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "Not something you want to get close to," he said grimly. The device on his dashboard was still clicking, louder and faster now, as if it were panicking. "Why is it following me?" she asked, her voice rising. "What did I do?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's not following you," he said. "It's hunting you." She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "Why? What does it want?" The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the wheel. "It's not what it wants," he said finally. "It's what you are." "What I am," she repeated, incredulous. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he yanked the wheel hard to the left, sending the truck skidding onto a narrow dirt road that wound through a cluster of jagged rocks. The creature was still behind them, closing the distance with unnerving speed. It didn't seem to touch the ground, its movements eerily smooth and fluid, like ink spreading through water. The truck's engine screamed as they raced through the winding terrain, the headlights casting long shadows against the rocks. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out another device, this one resembling a small metallic disc. He pressed a button on its side, and it began to glow faintly. "Take this," he said, shoving it into her hand. "What is it?" she asked, clutching the disc tightly. "Insurance," he said. If I don't make it, you'll know what to do." The words sent a jolt of fear through her. If you don't make it? What does that mean? He didn't respond. Instead, he slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. Before she could react, he threw open the door and stepped out, his weapon raised. The creature was almost upon them, its form shifting wildly as if enraged. "Stay in the truck," he said without looking back. "What are you doing?" she yelled, panic rising in her chest. "Buying you time," he said. Then he fired. The blast lit up the desert like a lightning strike, a burst of energy so bright it left spots dancing in her vision. The creature let out a sound that wasn't a scream but something deeper, something that vibrated in her bones and made her stomach churn. It staggered, its form flickering violently, but it didn't stop. The man fired again and again, each shot tearing through the night like thunder. But the creature kept coming, relentless and otherworldly. Nadia clutched the metallic disc, her mind racing. She didn't know what it was, didn't know what she was supposed to do, but she couldn't just sit there. She opened the truck door and stepped out, the cold air biting against her skin. The man turned, his eyes widening in alarm. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Get back." But it was too late. The creature's attention snapped to her, its movements accelerating. She raised the disc instinctively, and to her surprise, it began to hum, a low, resonant sound that seemed to ripple through the air. The creature hesitated, its form quivering as though it could feel the disc's presence. "Throw it," the man yelled. She didn't think, she just acted. She hurled the disc toward the creature, and the moment it left her hand, it erupted in a blinding flash of light. The sound was deafening, a low, guttural roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. When the light faded, the creature was gone. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Nadia stood there, trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. The man lowered his weapon, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. He turned to her, his expression grim. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice shaking. "I got the note." The man's eyes darkened. "That wasn't from me." She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "Then who?" Before she could finish, the ground beneath them began to hum, faint but unmistakable. The man's face went pale. "Get in the truck," he said. "Now." I noticed the sound first. A faint hum, low and resonant, threading through the apartment like a draft through an old window. At first, I thought it was coming from the fridge. That's where strange hums always come from, isn't it? But when I padded barefoot into the kitchen, the fridge was silent, too silent, like it was holding its breath. The hum didn't stop. It was subtle, but I could feel it in my bones, vibrating faintly in my chest, like when you stand too close to a bass speaker. It was 3 in the morning, the hour when the walls seem thinner, and the world feels not quite real. Outside my window, the city murmured softly, car horns blunted by the distance. I followed the sound through the dark, weaving between the ghostly shapes of my furniture. It led me to the hallway closet, the one where I keep winter coats I don't wear and a box of things I'm not ready to throw out. My hand paused on the doorknob, as if some part of me already knew this was the point of no return. I opened the door. The closet looked the same as always, too small, a little musty. But the hum was louder now, pulsing from somewhere deeper than the space should allow. It was coming from the box. The box was unremarkable, a plain cardboard thing sealed with yellowing tape. It was heavier than I remembered as I hauled it out and set it on the floor. The hum rattled faintly against the floorboards. My breath caught. With fingers that felt clumsy and strange, I tore the tape away and lifted the lid. Inside was something I didn't recognize at first, something wrapped carefully in thick, gray cloth. The hum was coming from within. I reached for it, the tips of my fingers tingling like I was touching live wire. When I unwrapped the cloth, I found an object that made my mind stutter and fall silent. It was a key. Not just any key, though. It was beautiful, almost alive in its intricacy. It was forged from some dark metal that shimmered like oil in the light. Strange patterns, almost like veins, ran along its shaft, pulsing faintly with that low hum. I held it in my palm, and the sound sharpened, as if the key had recognized me. I didn't know where it came from or why I had it, but I knew it was important. The kind of important that doesn't need explanations. I turned it over in my hand, half expecting it to burn, but it was cool, like stone in winter. And then I noticed the faint light coming from the closet. I glanced back. The closet looked wrong. The back wall was no longer a wall at all. Instead, there was a door. It hadn't been there before. I would have remembered a door like that. It was tall and narrow, made from dark wood with carvings that spiraled like ancient writing. At its center was a keyhole. I felt the hum in my chest, stronger now, as if it was calling me forward. I didn't even think about it. I just stood, the key clutched tightly in my hand, and walked toward the door. The moment I stepped into the closet, the air changed. It grew heavier, denser, like the air before a storm. I could smell it, too. Something earthy and metallic, like wet leaves and old pennies. The key slid into the lock without resistance. The hum swelled into a deep vibration that made the walls tremble. I turned the key. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. I stepped through. The first thing I noticed was the sky. It wasn't the sky I knew. It was vast and endless, a swirl of purples and blues flecked with silver, like someone had spilled galaxies across velvet. The air hummed softly, resonating in my chest, in time with something I couldn't see. Beneath my feet was a pathway made of stones that glowed faintly with each step, leading into a forest that didn't look real. The trees were too tall, their trunks gnarled and twisting upward like petrified bones. Their leaves shimmered like glass, catching the light and scattering it in fractured rainbows across the path. I walked forward because there was nothing else to do. The forest was alive with sounds, strange chirps and rustles that echoed like whispers. At one point, I swore I heard laughter. A child's laugh, distant but unmistakable, though I couldn't see anyone. I thought about turning back, but when I looked behind me, the door was gone. The pathway stretched endlessly in both directions. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt strange there, slippery and unreliable. Eventually, the path led me to a clearing. At its center was a fountain made of black stone, its surface smooth and flawless as obsidian. Water spilled from the mouth of a statue perched at the top, a creature with wings that curled around its body like armor and eyes that glowed faintly in the gloom. The water was dark, too, but not like water at all. It rippled thickly, like liquid shadow. The hum was deafening here, reverberating through the ground, through me. I approached the fountain, the key still clutched in my hand. Its pulse had quickened, as though it knew something I didn't. Carved into the stone basin was a line of writing, in the same looping symbols I'd seen on the door. As I stared, the letters shifted, reshaping themselves into words I could read. To remember what is lost, you must give what is yours. My heart hammered. I didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but some part of me did. The kind of knowing that lives in the marrow of your bones, even if your brain can't catch up. I knelt beside the fountain. The water, if you could call it that, shimmered with faint ripples as I leaned closer. I saw my reflection, but it wasn't just me. It was every version of me. A child, wide-eyed and grinning as I ran through sprinklers in the summer. A teenager, angry and alive, screaming lyrics into the void of my bedroom. A tired adult, staring blankly at a computer screen in an office that felt like a cage. They were all me, layered over one another like echoes in glass. I don't know what compelled me, but I raised the key over the water. It pulsed once, then went still, as though it understood what was coming. I let it drop. The moment the key touched the water, the fountain exploded with light, blinding, golden, and impossibly warm. It washed over me like a wave, knocking me back, and for a moment, I felt everything. Every joy, every grief, every heartbeat I'd ever lived through. The light filled me up, spilling into every corner of myself until there was no room for anything else. And then it was dark. I woke up on the floor of my closet, the box sitting empty beside me. The key was gone. So was the door. The hum had vanished, leaving behind an unnatural stillness that made my ears ring. I sat up, my hands shaking, and looked around as if expecting the forest or the fountain to be there with me. But there was nothing. Just coats and dust and cardboard. Everything should have felt the same, but it didn't. The apartment felt brighter, as though someone had turned up the saturation on the world. My chest felt light, my mind clear, like I'd let go of something heavy I'd carried for years without realizing it. The hum hasn't returned, and the key never came back. I don't think it was ever meant to stay with me. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I'll catch a flicker of light in the corner of my eye, or hear laughter drifting from nowhere in particular. And I wonder if that forest is still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. Have you ever touched something that felt like it didn't belong to this world, but somehow belonged to you? The whole thing started because I didn't want to pay for parking. It was a rainy Thursday evening, the kind of cold, slushy rain that seeps through your shoes and makes you question every decision that brought you to this point in your life. I had to meet a friend downtown for dinner, and the closest parking garage charged an obscene $20 flat rate. My brain, always eager to save a buck, whispered, "There's got to be free parking somewhere." That's how I ended up circling the back streets, looking for an empty curb. After about 10 minutes, I found one. An oddly wide space between two rusted dumpsters in an alley that didn't even seem to have a name. Sure, it was sketchy, but it wasn't marked as a tow zone, so I took it as a win. I grabbed my umbrella and ran for the restaurant, leaving my car shivering in the rain. Dinner was fine. Nothing remarkable, just overpriced tapas and a friend recounting her boyfriend drama for the 100th time. It wasn't until I was walking back to my car, the rain now a soft drizzle, that I noticed something was off. The alley was darker than I remembered. The streetlights that had been flickering earlier were completely out now, and the air felt heavy, like the weight of an unspoken secret. My car was still there, but as I approached, I realized I wasn't alone. A man was standing next to it, wearing a long black coat and holding a briefcase. His back was to me, and he didn't move when I called out, "Can I help you?" He turned around slowly, and for a moment, I wished he hadn't. His face was sharp, pale, and unsettlingly symmetrical, like someone had carved it out of porcelain and forgotten to give it any warmth. His eyes, an unsettling shade of gray, seemed to reflect the dim light around us. He tilted his head, studying me like I was a question he didn't know how to answer. "You parked in the gap," he said, his voice smooth and cold. It wasn't a question. "The gap?" I echoed, clutching my umbrella tighter. I didn't know if I was in danger, but my instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. He pointed to the space where my car was parked, his expression unreadable. "That's not an ordinary space. It's transitional. A threshold. People don't usually stop here." I stared at him, then at my car. It was just a normal parking spot, wasn't it? A cracked patch of asphalt surrounded by graffiti-covered walls. Nothing about it screamed transitional threshold. "Okay," I said slowly, inching toward my car door. "Well, I'm just gonna go now." "You can't," he interrupted, stepping closer. His presence felt like static electricity, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Once you've parked in the gap, you have to cross through it. There's no going back the way you came." "What are you talking about?" I snapped, the unease in my chest blooming into panic. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I'll just leave, okay?" But as I reached for my car door, the world shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no flash of light or swirling vortex, just a subtle, almost imperceptible flicker, like when a film reel skips a frame. One moment, I was standing in a dark, wet alley. The next, I was somewhere else. The alley was gone. In its place was a vast, empty expanse of mist that stretched out in every direction. The ground beneath my feet felt solid, but looked like it was made of polished obsidian, reflecting the gray haze above. The air was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ache. My car and the man in the coat were gone. I spun around, heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on a low stone pedestal in the middle of the nothingness, her figure barely visible through the mist. As I approached, I realized she wasn't sitting. She was floating, her feet a few inches off the ground. Her dress was made of something that shimmered like oil on water, constantly shifting colors as she moved. Her eyes, a deep, endless black, locked onto mine the moment I stepped closer. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but resonant, like the hum of a tuning fork. "You found yourself in the between." "The between?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "What does that even mean? Where am I? I didn't mean to." "You parked in the wrong place," she interrupted, a faint smile playing on her lips. "The gap is a doorway, and now you're here." "Where is here?" I demanded, my voice cracking. She tilted her head, considering me. "It's not quite a where. More of a when not, or a there almost. The between is a crossroads, a meeting place for those who've slipped through the cracks of their world." I didn't understand a word of what she was saying, but before I could argue, something moved in the mist behind her. A shadow, tall and hulking, with glowing red eyes that flickered like embers. I froze as it slithered closer, its form constantly shifting, impossible to pin down. The woman didn't seem concerned. "Ah," she said, glancing at the creature with mild interest. "You've been noticed. That's unfortunate." "Unfortunate how?" I whispered, taking a step back. "Once they see you, they rarely let you leave," she said, her voice almost amused. "But don't worry, I can help you. For a price." "A price?" I echoed, my stomach twisting. "What kind of price?" She smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't comforting. "That depends. What do you value most?" Before I could answer, or refuse, the shadow lunged toward me, its presence like a gust of freezing wind. I stumbled backward, tripping over the slick ground. But just as the creature's glowing eyes loomed over me, the woman raised her hand, and the air around us crackled. There was a flash of blinding light, and suddenly, I was back in the alley. Rain was falling softly, the dumpsters glistening under the faint glow of the streetlights. My car was exactly where I'd left it, looking as innocent as a guilty party caught in the act. The man with the briefcase was gone, and the world felt normal again. Almost too normal, like the scene had been reset just for me. I didn't wait to question it. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I'll hear a faint hum, like the echo of that woman's voice. Other times, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow with flickering red eyes, only for it to disappear when I turn to look. I don't park in alleys anymore, and I always pay for parking. Have you ever had something happen that you can't explain, no matter how hard you try? This morning, my entire existence turned into a quirky indie movie. One of those weird ones where nothing makes sense at first, but by the end, you're emotional over a metaphor about socks or something. Here's how it started. I opened my eyes to find my alarm clock staring at me. Yes, staring. It had sprouted two googly-looking eyes on its digital screen, which blinked in sync with its usual beeping. "Good morning, sleepyhead," it chirped in a tone that felt way too cheery for 6:47 a.m. "Don't snooze me. You're already running late." I flung my pillow over my head to drown out the noise, but the pillow groaned dramatically. "Oh, sure, just smother me. That's fine. It's not like I spent all night supporting your oversized skull or anything." That got my attention. I sat up, blinking at my suddenly self-aware alarm clock and my diva of a pillow. "What in the—" I started to say, but my bed frame creaked beneath me like a disapproving parent. "Language," it said. "Some of us are too refined for that kind of talk." Refined? It was a bed frame. A wobbly IKEA bed frame held together by my own half-hearted assembly skills. "Okay, what is happening right now?" I demanded, glancing around my room. That's when my closet door slid open just a crack, and the muffled voices of my wardrobe drifted out. "She's definitely going to pick the same sweatshirt again," one shirt muttered. "Ugh, probably," said another. "We never go anywhere interesting. Why bother dressing up?" "No one's picking you, Susan. You're dry clean only," snapped a dress. At this point, my brain had two options: total meltdown or blind acceptance. I went with the latter because, honestly, I wasn't caffeinated enough for a breakdown. As I stumbled into the bathroom, the mirror greeted me with an unsolicited critique. "Well, someone looks like they had a rough night," it said, its reflective surface shimmering smugly. "Wow, thanks for that," I replied, trying not to glare at my own disheveled reflection. "Don't shoot the messenger," the mirror quipped. "I just reflect the truth." Then, to my complete and utter disbelief, my shower pipes started humming, like full-on singing. They didn't have great voices, but their enthusiasm was undeniable. "Come on in, the water's fine," they belted in unison, adding jazzy little riffs that echoed off the tiles. I didn't even bother questioning it at this point. I just showered to the soundtrack of my plumbing system's greatest hits and moved on with my day. In the kitchen, things only got weirder. The coffee maker greeted me with a sigh of exasperation. "You know, if you clean me once in a while, maybe I wouldn't take so long to brew." The toaster chimed in. "At least you get used every day. I'm lucky if I see a Pop-Tart once a week." The fridge, always a drama queen, gasped when I opened it. "Do you ever stop and think about how many innocent leftovers you've let die in here? Do you?" Because I do. Every day. Juniper, my cat, hopped onto the counter, gave the fridge a disdainful look, and then turned to me. "So," she said, "you've finally tuned in to the world around you. Took you long enough." "Tuned in?" I repeated, reaching for my coffee like it might offer me some semblance of sanity. "You can hear us now," she explained, licking her paw as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "Everything's alive, obviously, but most humans are too self-absorbed to notice. It's tragic, really. Wait, so, everything? Like, everything? Yes," she replied impatiently. "Don't make this weird." I was about to argue that this was, in fact, extremely weird, but then my chair squeaked beneath me. "Could you maybe sit up straight for once?" it asked. "Your posture is killing me." I choked on my coffee. The rest of the day was like living in some surreal sitcom where every object around me had suddenly become a supporting character. My sneakers whined about being overworked. "We're tired." "Okay. You never use the nice flats." My phone complained about how often I drop it. "Do you know what that does to my screen?" Even my keys scolded me. "You lose me one more time," they said ominously, and were staging a walkout. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or just embracing this bizarre reality. The mailman gave me a weird look as I mumbled, "I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to my shoes," but honestly, I didn't care. The strangest part? I kind of liked it. Sure, it was annoying that my couch had opinions about how I sat on it. One corner again? Really? I'm more than just a perch, you know? But there was something endearing about hearing my world come to life. Even the trees outside my window had started chatting. "That squirrel's back," one muttered, "always burying acorns in the worst places." "Be nice," said another. "He's just trying to survive." Survive? The squirrel, who was perched on the branch, piped up. I heard that. And for the record, I'm a visionary. By the time evening rolled around, I was starting to see the charm in all of this. Sure, my microwave had told me off for reheating soup too often, learn to cook something new for once, and the ceiling fan called me out for never dusting it. But my home felt alive in a way I'd never noticed before. Even Juniper seemed impressed by my ability to adapt. As I climbed into bed, my blanket wrapped around me snugly. "Good night," it said, softer than before. "You did okay today." "Thanks," I murmured, feeling oddly comforted. Even my pillow didn't complain this time, just muttered a sleepy, "sweet dreams." And as I drifted off, I couldn't help but wonder, if you could live in a world where everything around you came alive, your furniture, your cat, even the squirrel in your yard, would you embrace the chaos? Or would you lose it entirely? Because honestly, I think I'm kind of thriving. This morning, the city decided to show off. It began with the sound of wind chimes where there shouldn't have been any, just a faint tinkling as I stepped out of my apartment building. I paused, listening. Nothing. The sound had vanished, like a ghost brushing past me on its way to somewhere else. Shrugging it off, I headed toward the train station, the world still groggy with sleep. The sky was that soft gray that makes you wonder if the sun will ever bother to show up, and the streets were slick from a rain that had disappeared before I'd woken up. Everything felt just a little off. like the city was playing a joke I hadn't figured out yet. Halfway down the block, I passed a woman pulling a suitcase that squeaked with every step. She was muttering under her breath, something about how they always forget the important part. I had no idea who they were or what they'd forgotten, but the conviction in her voice made me want to ask. Instead, I just stepped around her, nodding politely when she shot me a glance. She kept muttering as she rolled on, the squeak, squeak, squeak of her suitcase fading into the background like a broken metronome. At the corner deli, the usual guy in the Mets cap was setting out crates of oranges, but today he'd arranged them into an actual pyramid. I'm talking Egyptian-level symmetry. I slowed down, admiring his work, and he caught me staring. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice half a growl, half a laugh. I wasn't sure if he meant the oranges or the act of knocking them over, but I raised my hands in surrender and kept moving. Behind me, a woman with a stroller stopped to buy one, and I heard him say, "Top of the pyramid, lady. Luckiest one." The woman laughed, but I caught her pocketing the orange with a kind of reverence, like she believed him. When I reached the subway station, the stairs were buzzing with that specific energy that only exists underground. The sound of footsteps clattered against the tiled walls, echoing into infinity. At the bottom of the stairs, a busker was playing the accordion, badly, but he didn't seem to care. His whole body swayed with the music, his eyes closed like he was on stage at Carnegie Hall. People rushed past him without a glance, but I noticed a little girl tugging on her dad's hand, pointing at the musician. Her dad sighed, handed her $1, and she skipped over to drop it in the open accordion case. The man didn't stop playing, but he opened one eye and winked at her. She beamed as if she'd just saved the day. The train platform was packed. Too many people for this early in the morning. Everyone was crammed together, and yet there was this weird rhythm to it, like a murmuring tide. A guy in a rumpled suit was holding a coffee cup so precariously it felt like a countdown to disaster. Behind him, a woman in neon running shoes was scrolling through her phone with the kind of intensity usually reserved for major life decisions. Near the edge of the platform, a man was juggling 3 apples. Juggling. He wasn't asking for tips or performing for anyone in particular. He was just juggling. The apples arced through the air, catching the dim light of the station as they spun. Nobody said a word about it. That's the thing about this city. A man juggling apples at 7:30 a.m. barely registers as unusual. When the train arrived, the doors opened with that sharp hiss that always feels like an invitation and a warning all at once. I squeezed inside, wedged between a guy with a massive backpack and an older woman clutching a bouquet of daisies wrapped in brown paper. The smell of the flowers was so out of place in the damp, metallic air of the subway car that it made me dizzy for a second. The woman must have noticed me glancing at them because she smiled and said, "They're for me. Sometimes you've got to buy yourself flowers, you know?" I nodded, and she added, "People think that's sad. I think it's power." Then she turned her attention back to the flowers, inhaling deeply as if the whole train wasn't there. The train jerked forward, and everyone swayed in unison, like seaweed caught in a current. A teenager sitting across from me was sketching in a notebook, his pen scratching furiously against the page. I couldn't see what he was drawing until he shifted, and the light caught the paper just right. It was the subway car. Us. All of us. The juggling apple man was there, frozen mid-arc. The woman with the flowers was smiling at something only she could see. Even me, leaning against the door, had been reduced to lines and shadows. The drawing wasn't finished, but it was already alive. I thought about asking him about it, but the intensity on his face told me he wasn't anywhere near this train. He was somewhere else entirely, pulling this strange, beautiful moment out of thin air. At the next stop, I got off and climbed the stairs back to the surface. The air smelled different, brighter somehow, like the world had decided to scrub itself clean while I wasn't looking. I walked through the park on my way to work, cutting across the grass because I was already late and didn't care. A man was standing under a tree, holding up his phone like he was recording the branches. I slowed down, curious, and realized he wasn't filming the tree. He was recording the sound of the leaves rustling in the breeze. He caught me watching and smiled. "They sound like rain, don't they?" I listened for a moment, They did. Never noticed that before, I said. He nodded, satisfied, as if he'd just taught me something important. When I finally reached my office, my coworker Mark was sitting at his desk, eating a breakfast sandwich with the kind of focus you usually see in meditation classes. "You're late," he said through a mouthful of egg and cheese. "Had a morning," I replied, dropping my bag and sinking into my chair. He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. I wouldn't have known how to explain it anyway. I sat there for a moment, staring at my computer, thinking about all the odd little things that had unfolded in just a couple of hours. The orange pyramid, the juggling apples, the leaves that sounded like rain. It was like the city had woken up and decided, just for today, to let me see its magic. I wondered how much of it I usually missed, rushing from one place to the next without looking up. Have you ever had a day like that? Where the ordinary world suddenly feels like it's playing tricks on you, just to see if you're paying attention. What did you notice? A low hum, faint at first, like the vibration of a string being plucked in another room. I heard it on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that feels like it's asleep and waiting for Friday to wake it up. I was at my desk, ignoring a pile of emails, spinning my pen in slow circles on the page of an open notebook. The hum grew louder, inching its way into my ears until it was all I could hear. Steady, deep, and almost alive. I pulled off my headphones, thinking something was wrong with my computer, but the sound didn't stop. I stood up, looked around my apartment, but there was nothing unusual except for the fact that the hum was coming from inside the closet. Now, I'm not proud of this, but my closet is a disaster zone. The kind of place where you shove things you don't want to think about. Old receipts, boxes of forgotten projects, shoes with no partners. It's the Bermuda Triangle of my apartment. I hadn't willingly opened it in months, but the sound was definitely coming from there. It was louder now, and for some reason, I felt certain that if I ignored it, something would happen, something I couldn't undo. I pressed my hand against the closet door and felt it vibrating faintly, like whatever was on the other side was trying to get out. When I opened the door, the humming stopped. My closet looked as chaotic as ever. Coats hanging awkwardly, a tangle of scarves spilling out of a basket, shoes kicked into corners. And yet, something was different. The back wall didn't look right. It was darker than it should have been, as though the closet didn't end where it was supposed to. I squinted, leaning in. My hand brushed a coat aside, and the darkness moved. Not a shadow, something moved. Before I could process what I was seeing, the floor shifted beneath me. The closet yawned open, the way a mouth does, and I felt myself falling. I didn't land with a thud. I landed with a sound like soft leaves being disturbed. I opened my eyes to find myself lying in a field of silver grass that swayed as if stirred by a wind I couldn't feel. The air smelled like rain, even though the sky was a muted, cloudless gray, streaked with ribbons of light like someone had painted faint golden trails across it. I sat up slowly, trying to understand what I was looking at. Trees surrounded the field, tall and impossibly thin, their branches spiraling toward the sky. I could hear birds, but they didn't sound like birds. The calls were too melodic, too deliberate, as though they were singing a language meant to be understood. I got to my feet, brushing silver blades of grass from my clothes, and turned in slow circles. There was no sign of the closet, no doorway, just the field and the trees and the strange ribbons of light. I tried to swallow the rising panic in my throat. Think logically, I told myself, though nothing about this place felt logical. I didn't know where I was, but I wasn't hurt. That was something. I started walking toward the tree line, hoping to find answers, or at least a path back to something familiar. The closer I got to the trees, the louder the air became. That hum had returned, not as a sound, exactly, but as a feeling in my bones. It felt like the earth itself was breathing, and I had stepped into its lungs. As I passed between the trees, I realized the branches weren't empty. They were covered in objects. Old keys, glass bottles filled with swirling smoke, dolls with painted faces, rusted lanterns that flickered with faint flames. Each object hung from the branches on thin silver strings, swaying gently like ornaments. I reached out to touch one, a small wooden box no larger than my palm. But the moment my fingers brushed it, the hum surged, and a voice echoed softly in my head. Not yet. I yanked my hand back, my heart hammering. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but I was still alone. The forest was silent now, except for the faint tinkling of the hanging objects shifting in some unseen breeze. I kept walking, faster now, as if I could outrun whatever this place was. After a while, the trees thinned, and I stepped into another clearing. This one wasn't empty. At its center stood a building. At least, I think it was a building. It looked like it had been built in a hurry by someone who only half remembered what buildings were supposed to look like. Its walls tilted at odd angles, and its roof spiraled upward like a frozen whirlpool. Windows, some round, some square, some too small to crawl through, were scattered haphazardly across its surface. A soft yellow light spilled from inside, flickering like candlelight. I didn't want to go in, but I also couldn't walk away. The hum had changed again, becoming more like a pulse that seemed to be pulling me forward. I climbed the uneven stone steps to the door, which was painted a chipped, peeling blue. I hesitated, but the handle was already turning beneath my hand, and the door creaked open before I could decide otherwise. Inside, the air was warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon and something older, something like earth and smoke. The room was small and cluttered, packed with objects that reminded me of the forest. Shelves lined the walls, overflowing with jars, books, and trinkets I couldn't name. A fire crackled in a hearth at the far end, and a figure sat in a high-backed chair beside it, as still as a statue. Hello? My voice sounded small, swallowed by the room. The figure stirred. It was a woman, or something shaped like one. Her skin was smooth and pale as bone, her hair long and dark, pooling over her shoulders like ink. She turned to look at me, and her eyes were what stopped me cold. They weren't eyes at all, but mirrors, small, perfect mirrors that reflected me back at myself. "You're late," she said, her voice as soft as rustling paper. "I'm sorry," I stammered, though I had no idea what I was apologizing for. She smiled faintly and gestured to the chair across from her. I didn't want to sit, but my legs moved on their own, folding me into the chair. She reached to the table between us and picked up something small and round, holding it out to me in her open palm. It was a marble, perfect and smooth, but inside it swirled a miniature storm, clouds twisting violently around a tiny spark of lightning. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice shaking. Her mirrored eyes blinked slowly. "A question with many answers. But that's not why you're here." "Then why am I here?" She tilted her head, and the marble pulsed faintly in her palm. "To choose." "Choose what?" Her smile widened, and for a second, I thought I saw something move in the depths of her eyes, something beyond the reflection of my face. "The path, the memory, the price." "I don't understand," I said. "You will," she replied, and before I could stop her, she pressed the marble into my hand. It was warm and vibrating, as though it was alive. The room tilted suddenly, and the hum returned in full force, wrapping around me, pulling me inward, downward. I woke up on the floor of my closet. My heart was pounding, my hand clenched tightly around something smooth and round. I opened my fingers slowly, and there it was, the marble. The storm still swirled inside it, tiny flashes of lightning illuminating the clouds. The humming had stopped. The closet was just a closet again, full of coats and tangled scarves. But I could feel something had shifted, deep in the corners of my mind. The world around me looked the same, but I wasn't sure it was the same. I still have the marble. Sometimes, when I hold it up to the light, I swear I hear the hum again, faint and distant, like it's waiting for me to come back. Maybe one day I will, but I don't know if I'll be able to find my way out a second time. I didn't mean to follow the balloon. It just happened. I was on my way home from the grocery store, minding my own business, when I saw it. Bright red, bobbing lazily through the air like it was leading some kind of secret parade. No string, no visible owner, just a rogue helium balloon drifting across the sky. It caught the afternoon sunlight in a way that made it look almost alive, like it had some purpose, some destination. And for reasons I still can't explain, I turned left instead of right, grocery bags rustling at my sides, and started walking after it. The thing about chasing a balloon is that it doesn't feel like chasing. It feels like following, like you've stumbled into someone else's story and they're leading you to the next chapter. The balloon drifted low over a cobblestone alley, past a group of teenagers filming themselves doing some kind of elaborate dance routine. They didn't even look up when I passed, too focused on getting their choreography right. The balloon hovered for a moment near a lamppost before catching an unexpected gust and shooting upward, right over a wrought iron gate that led to a park I'd never noticed before. The gate wasn't locked, so I pushed it open with my elbow, my grocery bag swinging awkwardly. The park was small but dense, overgrown with wildflowers and ivy that crept along every surface. It felt like the kind of place that shouldn't exist in the middle of a city. Too quiet, too untouched. The balloon floated ahead of me, its red surface stark against the green leaves, and for a moment I thought about turning back. But then I heard it, music. Not the tinny, overproduced kind you hear from someone's phone speakers. This was different. It sounded live, like a violin and maybe an accordion, the notes winding their way through the air like vines. I followed the sound, stepping carefully along a narrow path until I emerged into a clearing. That's when I saw them. A group of people, maybe a dozen, stood in a loose circle around a fountain, their faces lit with a kind of collective wonder. Some were dressed normally, like they just wandered in after brunch, but others looked like they'd stepped out of another time. A woman in a billowing dress covered in embroidered flowers. A man in suspenders and a newsboy cap, his shoes impossibly shiny. An older couple holding hands, their matching velvet jackets making them look like royalty who'd misplaced their thrones. At the center of it all was a man playing the violin, his bow moving so quickly it looked like it might catch fire. Next to him, an accordionist swayed back and forth, his eyes closed like he was dreaming the music into existence. The balloon floated lazily above them, as if it had been the one to call them all here. No one seemed to notice me at first, and I hesitated on the edge of the clearing, feeling like I'd stumbled into a scene that wasn't meant for outsiders. Then the violinist opened his eyes and looked straight at me. He didn't stop playing, but he gave the tiniest nod, as if to say, "It's okay. You're supposed to be here." So I stayed. I put my groceries down carefully near the edge of a bench and moved closer, drawn in by the music and the quiet hum of the crowd. A little girl in a yellow raincoat, even though it wasn't raining, danced near the fountain, her movements wild and uncoordinated, but somehow perfect. An elderly man with a silver cane tapped his foot in time with the music. Someone handed me a cup of something warm. Tea, maybe? I didn't even see who gave it to me, but it smelled like cinnamon and honey, so I drank it without question. The music changed, shifting into a faster tempo that made the clearing feel alive in a new way. People started clapping, their hands coming together like thunderclaps, and the little girl laughed so loudly it echoed off the trees. I caught myself smiling, that rare, unself-conscious kind of smile that sneaks up on you when you're not paying attention. It felt like the whole world had shrunk down to this one moment, this one clearing, and I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was part of it. Eventually, the music slowed again, the notes stretching out like the last rays of sunlight. The violinist lowered his bow, and for a moment, the clearing was utterly silent. Then someone started clapping, a single pair of hands that quickly turned into a storm of applause. The little girl shouted, "Again!" But the musicians just smiled, the kind of smile that says, "Maybe next time." People started to disperse after that, melting back into the trees like ghosts. I thought about asking someone what this was, some kind of pop-up event, a secret club. But the words felt heavy in my throat, like speaking them would break whatever spell had been cast here. The violinist caught my eye again as he packed up his instrument, and he gave me another nod, this one slower, almost conspiratorial. The balloon was still there, floating near the fountain. I thought about grabbing it. After all, it's what had brought me here. But something stopped me. It didn't feel like mine to take. Instead, I left it where it was, swaying gently in the breeze as I picked up my groceries and headed back to the gate. When I stepped out of the park, the city felt louder than it had before. A bus roared past, and someone shouted into their phone about being late. I turned to look back at the gate, but it was just a gate now, No sign of the wildflowers or the fountain or the music. It made me wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. If the balloon had just been an ordinary balloon after all. But then, as I reached into one of my grocery bags, my fingers brushed against something warm and smooth. I pulled it out, a small, perfectly round stone with a tiny flower painted on it. I don't remember picking it up, but there it was, sitting in my palm like a secret. I kept it. It's on my bookshelf now, next to a dusty copy of a book I haven't read in years. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly tired of the world, I pick it up and wonder if the balloon is still out there, leading someone else to their next chapter. And I wonder, have you ever found yourself swept up in something that didn't quite feel real? Like the universe had opened a door just for you? Because if you have, I'd love to know where it led. Last week, I had what I can only describe as an accidental existential crisis triggered by a toaster. It all started when I decided to treat myself to some sourdough bread. A splurge I justified by calling it artisan, because apparently, adding that word makes anything feel fancy enough to cost $6. I got home, popped a slice into the toaster, and then stood there, watching as it browned ever so slowly, when I noticed the little dial on the toaster. It was set to a 3, a reasonable level of toastiness. But then it hit me. What exactly does a 3 mean? Is it seconds? Minutes? The spiritual level of toast enlightenment? Why is this dial so vague? And why have we, as a society, accepted that the only control we have over the fate of our toast is a mysterious number? I started thinking about how much of modern life is like that, trusting strange, invisible forces to deliver outcomes we vaguely understand. Algorithms, Wi-Fi signals, even how the cloud works. I mean, what is the cloud? Really? My photos are just floating somewhere? If my toaster had Bluetooth, I'd probably trust it to know exactly how brown I like my bread. That's where we are now. As I was spiraling into this abyss of toaster philosophy, the bread popped up, perfectly golden. I felt triumphant, like I'd cracked some kind of cosmic code, only to realize that my triumph was over bread, which, honestly, felt very on-brand for me. Later that day, I decided to escape my brain by going for a walk downtown. The city was buzzing in that peculiar way it always does. Half chaos, half symphony. A man on the corner was playing the saxophone, and across the street, a food truck was advertising something called gourmet deconstructed tacos, which is apparently just code for a taco, but messier and twice the price. A couple nearby was arguing over whether to buy oat milk or almond milk from the organic market, and I realized, we live in an era where we have too many choices. Not bad choices, necessarily, just a lot of them. Milk alone has a roster bigger than a Hollywood blockbuster. Oat, almond, soy, cashew, macadamia, coconut, hemp, and, just to really throw you, actual cow's milk. Somewhere, a farmer is probably rolling his eyes at all of us. As I walked past the taco truck, I saw a group of kids who couldn't have been older than 10, choreographing what I could only assume was a TikTok dance. They had that fierce, laser-focused energy you only see in kids who are both absolutely fearless and also have absolutely no concept of dignity. I stopped to watch, fascinated. They clapped, spun, and dabbed, shouting things like, "No, Mason, your arm has to go higher." And okay, from the top, one more time. They were dead serious. And it was awesome. I couldn't help but wonder what the older generations would have done if they'd had this technology. Imagine our parents choreographing dances in the 80s, rocking leg warmers, and blasting Bon Jovi. Instead, they got to pass notes in class and hope no one intercepted them. I eventually found myself in a little park, where I sat down on a bench next to an older man feeding pigeons. He had this kind of serene look about him, like he had seen the world change 1,000 times and decided to just roll with it. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the kids still dancing a few yards away. "How every generation finds new ways to embarrass themselves." I laughed, and we started chatting. He told me about how, back in his day, you could embarrass yourself just by calling someone and getting the wrong number. "And God help you if you forgot why you called in the first place," he added. "Now they've got these phones that let you talk, type, and take pictures, and people still use them to send misspelled messages to the wrong person. Some things never change." As we talked, I realized how much I love that about life. That the specifics may shift, but the essence stays the same. The things that bring us joy, or laughter, or secondhand embarrassment are universal. Watching those kids dancing in the park wasn't so different from seeing someone trying to master a yo-yo trick decades ago. It's all just people trying to add a little flair to their lives. That night, I decided to make myself a proper dinner instead of just grazing on random snacks like I usually do. Cooking is one of those activities that I romanticize heavily until I'm actually doing it. In my mind, I'm about to create a meal so beautiful it belongs in a food magazine. In reality, I'm Googling what to do if you add too much salt, while smoke alarm beeps at me for the second time in 10 minutes. By the time I finally sat down to eat, I was staring at a plate of something that tasted fine but looked like it had been through a small hurricane. I posted a picture of it to my Instagram story anyway, because the lighting was good, and if there's one thing we all know, it's that social media rewards good lighting over actual skill. After dinner, I decided to unwind with a little screen time, because nothing says relaxing like staring at your phone for an hour. I fell into one of those deep rabbit holes where you start by watching a video of a cat playing piano and somehow end up learning about ancient Egyptian bread-making techniques. The internet is wild that way. One minute, you're laughing at memes. The next, you're questioning if you should get into pottery. By the time I crawled into bed, I couldn't help but marvel at how strange and beautiful life is right now. Every little thing, from TikTok dances to gourmet tacos to the philosophical mystery of toaster dials, feels like part of a much bigger story we're all writing together. It's chaotic, sure, but isn't that kind of the point? Chaos makes it interesting. What's something random or ridiculous in your daily life that secretly makes it unforgettable? It started with a letter in my mailbox, and that was strange enough, considering I hadn't received a handwritten letter in years. Even stranger, it had no return address, no stamp, just my name scrawled on the front in dark green ink. The paper inside was thick, almost velvety, and the message was short. You're invited to the gathering. Midnight. Follow the lights. There was no signature, no instructions, no explanation. Just those 6 words. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if it was some kind of prank. Midnight wasn't far off, and follow the lights sounded ominously vague, but something about the letter tugged at me, like it had been meant for me specifically, even though I had no idea why. By 11:45, curiosity had won. I grabbed a jacket, stuffed the letter into my pocket, and stepped outside. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. The street was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the streetlights. But then I saw it. A string of small, floating orbs of light, no bigger than marbles, bobbing gently in the air about 10 feet off the ground. They hovered in a loose line, leading away from my apartment and down the street. I followed. The lights moved slowly, like they wanted to make sure I could keep up. They guided me through back alleys I didn't recognize, across an empty park, and down a path that seemed to lead out of town entirely. The further I walked, the stranger everything felt. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of something sweet and unplaceable, and the stars overhead seemed brighter, as though the night itself was leaning in to watch. Finally, the lights stopped in front of an iron gate that looked like it had been plucked from the entrance to some ancient mansion. Beyond the gate was a dense forest, the trees alive with a faint, golden glow that pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. The gate creaked open on its own, and I hesitated. "Don't worry," came a voice behind me, and I jumped, spinning around to see a woman in a dark green cloak. Her eyes gleamed in the moonlight, sharp and knowing, like she was in on a joke I hadn't been told yet. "You've been chosen," she said, as if that explained anything. "Chosen for what?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "For the gathering, of course," she replied, her lips curling into a smile. Then she turned and walked through the gate without waiting for me. I stood there for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn around and go home. But instead, I followed her. The forest was alive. Not in the way all forests are alive, with rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. This was different. The trees whispered in a language I couldn't understand, their branches shifting as if to watch us pass. The golden glow wasn't just light. It was movement, swirling through the air like fireflies, darting around us and disappearing into the dark. After what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, we reached a clearing. And there it was, the gathering. It looked like something out of a dream. A massive bonfire blazed in the center of the clearing, its flames an impossible shade of blue. Around it, people danced and laughed, their faces painted with intricate designs that shimmered as they moved. Some wore elaborate costumes, feathered masks, flowing robes, antlers woven with flowers, while others were dressed like they just stepped out of their kitchens. The air hummed with energy, a mix of music and laughter, and something I couldn't name but felt deep in my chest. It was intoxicating, and for a moment, I forgot my confusion and just stared. "Drink this," the woman in the cloak said, appearing beside me and handing me a cup filled with something that glowed faintly gold. I hesitated, but she rolled her eyes. "It's not poison. It's tradition." I took a sip, and the world tilted. Not in a bad way. More like the edges of reality had softened, the colors around me deepening and swirling together. The hum in the air grew louder, wrapping around me like a song I'd always known but forgotten until that moment. "Let the night take you," the woman said, her voice distant and warm, and then she disappeared into the crowd. The next few hours, or maybe minutes or days, it was impossible to tell, were a blur. I danced around the fire with strangers who felt like old friends, their laughter ringing like bells. I watched someone toss a handful of powder into the flames, and they roared higher, forming shapes, dragons, wolves, constellations that moved like they were alive. At some point, I found myself talking to an old man sitting on a tree stump. His face was lined with wrinkles, his eyes sharp and bright. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "No idea," I admitted. He chuckled. "You will. The gathering finds those who need it, those who've lost their spark." "I haven't lost anything," I said automatically, but the words rang hollow, even to me. The man just smiled knowingly and handed me something. A small, smooth stone etched with the same crescent moon and star as the coin. "Hold on to this," he said. "It'll remind you." Of what? He didn't say. The night wore on, and eventually, the crowd began to thin. The music softened, the fire burned lower, and the golden glow in the trees began to fade. I found myself back at the edge of the forest, the iron gate in front of me once again. The woman in the cloak was waiting. "Did you enjoy yourself?" she asked, her tone teasing. "I still don't know what just happened," I admitted. She smiled. "You don't need to. Not yet." Before I could ask what she meant, she reached out and pressed something into my hand. When I looked down, it was the coin, polished and gleaming as if it were brand new. "Come back when you're ready," she said. "The lights will find you." I stepped through the gate, and when I turned back, the forest was gone. I've tried to find it again, retracing my steps a dozen times, but the path isn't there. The lights never returned. But sometimes, late at night, I take out the coin and the stone, and I swear I can hear faint music in the distance. I don't know when I'll be ready, but when I am, I'll be waiting for the lights. Have you ever been somewhere that felt like it was calling just to you? Like it existed outside of time, just for one fleeting moment? When I was 11, I found a place that shouldn't have existed, a hidden corner of the world that felt like it had slipped through the cracks, caught between what is and what might have been. I didn't tell anyone about it, not because I wanted to keep it a secret, but because I didn't have the words to explain it. Even now, all these years later, I'm not entirely sure it was real. But if it wasn't, then where did the feather come from? It started on one of those endless summer afternoons when the heat shimmered off the pavement and the air felt thick and drowsy. My parents had one rule back then: be home by dark. Everything else was fair game. I spent most days riding my bike around town, exploring alleys and backroads, looking for anything that might feel like an adventure. That day, I took the path that cut through the woods behind the library. I'd been down it 100 times, but this time, something was different. About halfway through the trail, I saw a glimmer of light through the trees. It wasn't the usual sunlight filtering through the branches. This was sharper, almost like the flash of a mirror. I stopped my bike, letting it fall into the underbrush, and stepped off the path. The woods were thick, the kind where the air changes as you go deeper, cooler and quieter. like stepping into another world. I followed the glimmer, pushing past ferns and vines until I came to a clearing. It was odd. The trees around the edges were taller than they should have been, their trunks twisted like they'd been caught mid-dance. In the center of the clearing was a pond, perfectly round, its surface so still it looked like glass. The glimmer I'd seen was coming from the water, reflecting something that didn't seem to be there. A crescent moon in broad daylight, hanging in the sky like it had forgotten where it belonged. But the strangest part was the bench. It was sitting right at the edge of the pond, old and weathered, with moss creeping up its legs and ivy winding around its backrest. It looked like it had been there for centuries, waiting for someone to sit down. I don't know why I didn't question it more at the time. Kids don't think like that. To me, it was just there, like it had always been, like it was supposed to be. I sat on the bench, because what else do you do when a bench like that is waiting for you? The moment I did, the world seemed to shift. The air grew still, not the kind of stillness you get on a calm day, but a deeper quiet, like the pause between heartbeats. And then I saw it, a ripple across the pond, even though there was no wind. Something was moving just beneath the surface, too quick to make out. At first, I thought it might be a fish, but then it broke the surface, and I realized how wrong I was. It wasn't a fish at all. It was a bird. At least, I think it was a bird. Its wings were enormous, sleek and black, like they'd been dipped in ink. Its body shimmered faintly, the way oil does in sunlight, and its eyes. Its eyes were golden, not just the color but the light itself, glowing softly like two embers. It didn't fly out of the pond so much as rise from it, water dripping from its feathers in slow, deliberate streams, like it was shaking off another world. It landed on the edge of the pond, not 5 feet from me, and tilted its head in that bird-like way, as if it was sizing me up. I don't know what I was expecting it to do, but I wasn't expecting it to speak. "You found it," it said, and its voice wasn't like any voice I'd ever heard. It wasn't loud or deep or booming. It was soft, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, and yet it carried weight, like every word mattered. I didn't know what to say. I think I just stared at it, my hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly my knuckles turned white. The bird seemed to find this amusing. Its golden eyes flickered with something that might have been laughter. "You're not the first," it said, "but it's been a while." "The first what?" I finally managed to ask, though my voice came out barely more than a whisper. "The first to find the place between." It spread its wings as it said this, and for a moment, I could see the faintest outline of stars shimmering across the feathers. "You should ask your questions now. The door doesn't stay open for long." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't have time to think. Questions spilled out of me before I could stop them. "What is this place? Who are you? Why does it feel like—" I hesitated. "Like a dream?" The bird tilted its head again, like it was deciding how much to tell me. "It's not a dream," it said finally, "but it's not quite real either. It's a seam, a thread between the fabric of things. As for me, I'm the keeper of this thread." It stepped closer, its talons clicking softly against the rocks. "People come here when they're meant to," it said, "not because they're looking, but because they've stopped. This place finds you when you forget to search." That didn't make much sense to me at the time, but there was something in the way it spoke that made me believe it, like it knew things I couldn't begin to understand. Before I could ask anything else, it unfurled its wings again, and this time, I could feel the wind of them brushing against my face. "The thread's not yours to keep," it said, its voice softer now, almost gentle, "but it leaves a mark. You'll carry it with you." And then it was gone. One moment, it was standing there, and the next, it had melted back into the water, leaving nothing but a faint ripple and the strange, heavy silence that had wrapped around the clearing from the start. I don't remember how long I sat there after that, staring at the pond, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, the sun began to dip low in the sky, and the spell broke. I got up, pushed my way back through the woods, and rode home in a daze, the tires of my bike crunching over gravel like nothing had changed. But something had changed. When I got home, I reached into my pocket without thinking and pulled out a feather, black as midnight, soft as velvet, with a faint shimmer that caught the light in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I don't remember picking it up, but I knew where it had come from. I still have it, tucked away in a box under my bed. Sometimes, when the world feels heavy and too solid, I take it out and hold it in my hands. It feels warm, like it's alive, and for a moment, I can hear the faint rustle of wings and the soft hum of a pond that doesn't exist anymore. So, tell me, have you ever found a place that didn't belong to this world? Or do you think it's only my imagination that does? It started with a strange, faint smell, the kind you can't place right away but sticks in your nose, insisting you figure it out. I was at the hardware store of all places, wandering through aisles that felt like a maze of possibility. Bolts, cans of paint, mysterious tools that I would definitely never use. I was there to buy duct tape, but the smell stopped me cold in the middle of the aisle, next to a display of garden gloves. It was warm and dry, with a faint hint of earth and wood, and something else. Something slightly metallic, like rusted iron mixed with sun-heated grass. For a moment, I stood there like a weirdo, sniffing the air. And then it hit me. Campfires. Not just any campfire, though. It was that campfire, the one we built the summer I turned 10. The memory hit me so hard it felt like someone had opened a trapdoor beneath me, dropping me straight into another world. Suddenly, I wasn't in the hardware store anymore. I was standing on the edge of a dusty clearing in the middle of the woods, surrounded by the chirp of crickets and the rustle of trees swaying gently in the wind. The campfire flickered in front of me, throwing out lazy sparks as it burned, its smoke curling up toward a blanket of stars. The air smelled like pine and dirt and the faint, greasy tang of marshmallows burning on skewers. I could see my cousin Jake poking at the fire with a stick, trying to feed it dried leaves he swore would make it burn brighter. Spoiler, they didn't. Our dog Pepper sat beside me, her ears perked up, her nose twitching as she followed the scent of the hot dogs we were roasting. I could feel the scratch of mosquito bites on my legs and the damp weight of my sweatshirt, which I had thrown on earlier to ward off the night chill. That was the summer my cousins and I had convinced our parents to let us sleep out in the woods behind the cabin. It's not even real camping, Jake had argued when my aunt protested. The house is like right there. We'll just come back if it gets scary. He had conveniently left out the part about us sneaking a bag of candy, a flashlight, and an old hand-me-down comic book collection into the tent. I don't remember how long we stayed up that night, but it felt infinite in the way only summer nights can. We told ghost stories, of course, all of them ridiculous and involving imaginary monsters with ridiculous names like Bogface and the Shadow Screecher. Jake swore up and down that he heard footsteps in the woods and even shushed us once, making everyone freeze and look around with wide eyes until we all burst out laughing when Pepper sneezed. What I remember most, though, was lying on my back just outside the tent, looking up at the sky. The fire had burned down to embers by then, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing, and Jake had fallen asleep with a comic book draped across his face. I don't think I'd ever seen so many stars in my life. The sky felt impossibly vast, like someone had stretched a glittering black sheet across the world. For the first time, I had this strange, wordless sense of how small I was, and yet, somehow, it didn't feel scary. It felt comforting, like being tucked into a story so big you couldn't even see the edges of it. Back in the hardware store, the memory lingered like smoke after a fire. I found myself standing there, holding a random pack of zip ties I didn't need, staring off into the middle distance as if I could see that star-filled sky through the fluorescent ceiling lights. For a moment, I felt like a kid again. Mud on my shoes, marshmallow on my fingers, and the quiet thrill of knowing the night was mine to explore. The thing is, I'd almost forgotten about that summer. I hadn't thought about it in years. The cabin had been sold long ago. The woods probably bulldozed for a subdivision or something. Jake and I don't talk much anymore, and Pepper, well, dogs don't stay around forever, do they? But standing there in that aisle, it all came rushing back. The warmth of the fire, the laughter, the stars. I left the hardware store without buying anything. I couldn't even remember why I'd gone in the first place. But when I got home, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I sat outside, lit a candle on the patio table, and stared at the sky. It wasn't the same, of course. The stars were harder to see through the city's light pollution, and the air smelled more like car exhaust than pine needles. But I sat there anyway, letting the memory wrap around me like a favorite old blanket. And for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of that kid I used to be. The one who believed in ghost stories and stayed up late to count the stars, who thought summer would last forever, and who knew the woods could hold both adventure and magic. It's funny how the past sneaks up on you, isn't it? Like a faint smell or a stray sound that cracks the present open just enough to let the light of another time shine through. So now I'm curious, what's been your crack in time? What little thing caught you off guard and sent you tumbling back into a memory you didn't even know you still carried? Alright, buckle up for this one, because it's the story of how I accidentally joined a secret underground game of Capture the Flag. And no, not the normal version you played at summer camp. This was intense. This was dangerous. And this, apparently, was real life. It started with a jacket. Specifically, a plain black windbreaker that I'd found draped over the back of a bench in the park near my apartment. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about an abandoned jacket. It happens all the time. But this one was different. First, it was in perfect condition, which is rare for lost items. Second, it had a small patch sewn onto the sleeve, a symbol that looked like an eye with an hourglass in the center. Something about it seemed deliberate, like whoever left it wanted someone to notice it. And because I'm a sucker for mystery, I did exactly what you're not supposed to do in situations like this. I picked it up. As soon as I flipped the jacket over, I noticed a folded piece of paper sticking out of the pocket. I hesitated for maybe half a second before pulling it out. Written on it, in blocky, all-caps handwriting, were the words, "If you find this, you have until 9 p.m., 212 Ravenwood. Don't be late." Okay, let me pause here to say that every part of my brain was screaming, this is how horror movies start. But I was bored and curious. And, frankly, my social life had been so uneventful lately that the prospect of wandering into a potentially life-threatening scenario felt exciting. So I did what any deeply questionable person would do. I showed up. Ravenwood wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but when I got there, I realized it wasn't a house or an apartment. It was an old abandoned office building with boarded-up windows and graffiti covering the walls. There was a faint glow coming from one of the windows on the second floor, and a steady stream of people, about my age, late 20s, were slipping inside through a side door. Some of them wore jackets with the same patch I'd seen earlier. "Here goes nothing," I muttered, pulling the jacket on to blend in, because I wasn't about to stand out as the one person who didn't know what was happening. Inside, the air was charged with nervous excitement. The building had been stripped of furniture, leaving behind only dusty concrete floors and flickering overhead lights. People were gathered in small groups, whispering and glancing around like they were waiting for something. That's when a guy with a bullhorn stepped into the center of the room. He was tall, with a buzz cut, and the kind of charisma that made you instantly pay attention. "Welcome, newcomers," he said, his voice booming. "If you're here, it means you've found the invitation. Congratulations, you've already proven you're resourceful enough to play. But before we begin, let me make one thing clear. Tonight isn't a game. It's a battle. You win, or you go home empty-handed." I was half expecting someone to explain what was actually happening, but no one did. Instead, Buzzcut raised his arm and snapped his fingers. The lights dimmed, and someone rolled out two massive flags, one red, one blue. They handed them to people who were clearly team captains. Buzzcut continued, "Your objective is simple. Get the other team's flag and bring it back to base. You've got 3 hours. The winning team takes the prize." "Wait, what prize?" I whispered to the girl standing next to me, but she just grinned and said, "You'll see." Before I could back out, someone handed me a blue armband and shoved me toward my team. There were maybe 30 of us, and the captain, a wiry guy with a bandana, quickly started barking orders like this was some kind of military operation. "Base is on the 3rd floor," he said. "We'll split into runners and defenders. Who here's fast?" A bunch of hands shot up, but I kept mine firmly down. I was not built for speed. I ended up in the defender group, which basically meant we were supposed to protect our flag and look menacing if anyone from the red team showed up. Easy enough, right? Wrong. The game started with a loud horn blast, and chaos erupted almost immediately. People were sprinting through the building, shouting directions and strategies like we were in some post-apocalyptic war zone. I stuck to the third floor, guarding the flag with a couple of other defenders who looked just as clueless as I felt. At first, it was quiet. Too quiet. Then we heard footsteps pounding up the stairwell. A guy from the red team burst into the room, grinning like he'd already won. "Nice flag," he said, lunging for it. Instinct kicked in. I grabbed the nearest object, a broken chair leg, and swung it like I was Gandalf defending the mines of Moria. The guy yelped, dodging out of the way, and tripped over a pile of debris. One of my teammates tackled him before he could recover, and we managed to hold him off long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It was exhilarating. Terrifying, but exhilarating. The rest of the night was a blur of running, hiding, and adrenaline-fueled skirmishes. I got tackled twice, narrowly avoided getting tagged by someone on the red team, and even managed to intercept one of their runners before they could escape with our flag. By the end of it, I was covered in dust, bruised, and more alive than I'd felt in years. When the final horn blew, the blue team was declared the winner. Everyone erupted into cheers, and Buzzcut reappeared, holding a black duffel bag. "Well done," he said, handing it to our captain. "Spend it wisely." Inside the bag? Cash. A lot of it. I'm talking several $1,000s in neatly stacked bills. My jaw dropped, but no one else seemed surprised. "It's the buy-in," someone explained when they saw my expression. "People pool their money to fund the prize. High risk, high reward." I should have been more shocked, but honestly, I was too exhausted to care. The captain split the winnings among the team, handing me an envelope with a crisp $100 bill inside. "You did good, defender," he said with a grin. I didn't go back the next week, or the week after that. But sometimes, when I'm walking through the park or sitting in a quiet coffee shop, I catch myself wondering about the others, the ones who stayed, the ones still playing the game. Maybe someday I'll go back. Maybe someday I'll put on the jacket again. What about you? Ever find yourself in a situation so wild and unexpected that it felt like you'd wandered into another reality? Because I'd love to hear about it. I woke up on the ceiling. At first, I thought it was a dream. One of those surreal ones where gravity doesn't care about physics and you just roll with it. But then I noticed the details. My comforter was stuck to me, not dangling toward the floor. My bedside lamp was sitting upside down on the ceiling floor, as if it belonged there. The only thing that seemed out of place was me. "Oh, you're finally up," said a voice below me, or above, depending on how you looked at it. I craned my neck to see my cat, Waffles, lounging on the proper side of the room like a smug monarch, except she was sitting in an armchair that didn't exist in my bedroom. Also, she was wearing a tiny pair of reading glasses and flipping through what looked like a magazine titled Existence Monthly. "Waffles?" I asked, my voice an octave higher than usual. She looked up from her magazine and sighed. "Took you long enough. Do you know how boring it's been waiting for you to notice?" "Notice what?" I asked, my brain still struggling to reconcile the fact that my cat was talking. "Why am I on the ceiling? And why are you? Speaking? Reading? Being fabulous?" She adjusted her glasses and snapped the magazine shut. "I think the bigger question is why it took you this long to catch on. The flip happened days ago." "What flip?" I asked, clutching the comforter around me like it was a shield. She rolled her eyes. "Reality flipped. Up became down. Down became up. The usual cosmic hiccup. Honestly, you're lucky it's just a localized inversion this time. Last time, we lost Tuesdays for a month." "What do you mean reality flipped?" "That's not a thing. Reality doesn't just—" "Oh, doesn't it?" she said, leaping gracefully from the chair and landing upside down on the ceiling next to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Tell that to the sock drawer. It hasn't stopped crying." As if on cue, I heard a faint sniffle. I turned toward my dresser, and sure enough, the drawer where I keep my socks was shaking slightly. "Why me?" it whispered, voice quivering. "I just wanted to hold socks. Now I'm a liar. I can't even tell which way is up anymore." Hey, I said, crawling awkwardly toward the dresser. "It's okay. You're still a great sock drawer." "Liar," it sobbed. "You're lying. Nothing makes sense anymore. Before I could argue with a piece of furniture, the door to my bedroom swung open, or rather, downward, and a parade of objects marched in. A toaster wearing a tiny crown led the procession, followed by a swarm of floating teacups and what appeared to be my laundry basket, now wearing a red sash that read Ambassador. "What is happening?" I asked, staring as the group spread out across the room. "Delegation," Waffles said casually, licking her paw. "The items voted, and they decided to send a representative to discuss the terms of the inversion." The terms? Who's in charge of this? Why is my laundry basket wearing a sash? "Because it's dignified," the laundry basket said, puffing itself up. "And frankly, I've had enough of being taken for granted. You never wash me, you know." "What?" I spluttered. "You're a basket. You hold dirty clothes. That's literally your job." "And yet I do it without complaint," it snapped. "But now that the inversion's given me a voice, I think we need to renegotiate my working conditions." I pinched the bridge of my nose, trying to piece together the absolute chaos around me. "Okay, stop. Just stop. None of this makes any sense. Why is everything alive? Why is my cat talking? Why is gravity broken?" "Because reality is bored," Waffles said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You know how sometimes you rearrange your furniture because you're tired of how everything looks? Well, the universe does that too. Every once in a while, it just shakes things up." "Shakes things up? This is a nightmare." "Relax," she said, stretching lazily. "It's temporary. Probably." "Probably?" The toaster cleared its throat, or at least, made a sound that vaguely resembled a throat clearing. "If I may," it said, its voice regal and slightly metallic. "We have gathered to discuss how to bring balance to this topsy-turvy world. The ambassador," it gestured toward the laundry basket, "has some proposals." "Proposals?" I asked weakly. "Yes," said the laundry basket, stepping forward. "First, we demand equal respect for all household objects. No more kicking us under the bed or shoving us into closets. Second, a mandatory rotation system for duties. I, for one, would like to try being a decorative planter." "That's not how any of this works," I said, my voice edging toward hysteria. "Actually, it's exactly how it works now," Waffles said, leaping onto my shoulder. "You're the only human left in this zone, which makes you the negotiator. The universe put you here to fix this." "I don't want to fix this. I just want to go back to normal." "Then negotiate," Waffles said, her tone sweet but sharp. "Otherwise, enjoy living on the ceiling forever." The crowd of objects murmured in agreement, their voices blending into a surreal cacophony. The teacups floated closer, their delicate handles raised like fists. "We demand cushier coasters," one shouted. "No more crumbs in the toaster," another added. "I just want socks that match," sniffled the drawer. "Enough," I shouted, throwing up my hands. The room fell silent, every object turning toward me. "Fine. You want balance? You want respect? Let's compromise." The negotiations were absurd. The teacups wanted their own shelf away from the mugs. The laundry basket demanded weekly rest breaks, where it could lounge empty. Even the ceiling fan chimed in, requesting a better view of the TV. By the time we reached an agreement, I was sweating and utterly exhausted. "Done," I said, signing the parchment that had mysteriously appeared in midair. "Are we good now? Can reality go back to normal?" The objects nodded, or wobbled, or floated in a way that felt like nodding. The toaster raised its crown. "We accept these terms." The moment the words left its non-existent mouth, the world shifted again. Gravity snapped back to normal, and I tumbled out of bed, landing on the floor with a thud. My bedroom was back to its usual state. No talking objects, no parades, just silence. For a moment, I thought it was all a dream, until I noticed Waffles sitting on my desk, still wearing her tiny reading glasses. "You did good, champ," she said with a yawn. "Now feed me." Negotiators still have to take care of their queens. So here's my question. If your household objects came alive and started making demands, what do you think they'd ask for? And how long do you think you'd last as their negotiator?